Pretty good. How are you doing?
Excited to chat today. I know you had a bit of a spicy day yesterday, hey?
My days are always spicy. That's what we do here.
Uh,
Do you want to introduce yourself and why you wanted to chat, so that people know who you are? Not like your
sure.
name and address, but just like your qualifications and everything.
Yeah, sure. I'm going by Not So Erudite on social media. My name is Kyla, though. I am a psychometrician. That's my kind of highest level of professional training, and I am going to school for a master's in. I'm sure lots of people in your chat might feel weird about this one, but master's in clinical psychology, where I'm going to be specializing in forensics in teens specifically, but it's a child and youth clinical psych program. I'm also a licensed addictions counselor as well. So that's kind of my background at this time. Um, and yeah, I wanted to talk to you about a number of topics in psychology. I'm not even sure what's the likelihood of us getting to all of them necessarily today,
Oh boy.
because, oh yeah.
Okay. Well, what is a? Can you explain to me? I don't know. What is a psychometrician? I've never heard that
Yeah,
before.
yeah, nobody knows. It's very obscure. So it's actually one of the few areas in the field that's not. It doesn't actually have a college body yet, so I can't like be a licensed psychometrician yet. It's basically like if you get the training or you have a job titled psychometrician, you're considered a psychometrician. So it's basically people specialized in administering psychological tests. So tests that you need specific training for is going to include things like IQ testing, um, neuropsychological testing, so testing for like brain injuries and stuff like that through
Hmm.
cognitive testing rather than just MRIs alone. And I'm trained in specifically forensic assessment as well, so determining risk levels of offenders if they're going to what we call recidivate, which is just reoffend when they get
Hmm.
released. Um, so that's what a psychometrician does. We run a bunch of tests and diagnoses, and usually we work in conjunction with a psychologist, who then typically they would be diagnosing.
Hmm.
However, I'm going into clinical psych, so I kind of the reason I did
Gotcha.
psychometry was so that I was a well-informed psychologist and I could kind of do it myself.
So psychometry is essentially trying to specialize the job that is just kind of like included under other jobs.
Mm-hmm.
So like, just so I can understand. So if I were to go to see a psychologist and I wanted to get like a test to see if I have ADHD or some other sort of cognitive test, whereas before maybe the psychologists themselves might perform that test, you would come in and you would do that independently because you'd have more specialized training in conducting those tests.
Yeah, ideally. Not everyone uses a psychometrist by any means,
Mm-hmm.
but at least in like Canada, almost everywhere that's much more government organized is going to be using psychometrists because they're actually usually better trained than the psychologists themselves in the administration and the analysis of the data. And then they kind of offer that up, and they kind of, depending on the relationship you have, you're kind of like, hey, just so you know, like these are their findings, and then the psychologist might just be the one reporting the findings. Usually the
Mm-hmm.
psychometrist wouldn't be reporting it to the client though at all.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Okay. All right. Where do you want to start?
Okay, I'll give you some options. Tell me where you want to start.
So wait, why? Okay.
Just whatever piques your interest. I think like conversations are more interesting when you're interested in them, right? When both parties are interested. So, I had messaged you about your conversation with the counselor uh, several weeks, more than a month ago, I think now in December.
Mm-hmm.
He, I think, was a licensed counseling therapist, or was he a psychologist by the time you guys were chatting?
I talked to like four or five of them because there was a bunch that came off the end of other conversations we had with whether or not police officers should show up at wellness checks. So I'm not going to remember which one it is, but
That's fair.
um, yeah.
I think the video on YouTube is titled like sociopathy. He talks a lot about like what happened to the dicks, stuff like that. There's just a bit of information there. Overall, I was content with
Mm-hmm.
it, but there's some unempirical information, so we can talk about my thoughts on that. We can talk about I have like a really big interest, and I think everyone needs to know that about like what I call the iron curtain of the field of psychology. Um, I think it's actually really important, and most people don't know about it. Um,
What is the Iron Curtain of Psycho? I've
I,
never heard this term before.
I know
Okay.
I get everyone's interest with that spicy wording. I'm so it's definitely something I'm labeling it as. It's basically a lot of people don't understand that there is absolutely a distinction between researching psychologists and practicing psychologists. And while they
Oh, okay.
obviously interact with one another, a lot of counseling psychologists will use authority that I
Hmm.
like. Um, they'll kind of refer to themselves as experts on
Hmm.
psychological research information that I would argue they absolutely are not experts in. They're experts in like the art of working with people. So
Gotcha. Yeah. So with respect to the something chat is bringing us up. So something that I've heard in the past is that one of the are you familiar with the DSM? Do you care
mhm,
about that at all? Okay. Yeah.
yeah,
One of the criticisms I've heard with the DSM-5 is that it overrepresented for clinical practicing psychologists, and it didn't pay attention enough to people that worked in research. And people sometimes were critical of some of the findings as a result of that, because obviously both halves of these are very important, or arguably maybe even the research side should be weighted a little bit more for this.
probably the research side. I haven't heard that criticism of the DSM in Canada, at least. Our major criticism, and why in Canada there's kind of a branch. A lot of us are starting to use the ICD-10, which is more
Yeah,
common in Europe as well,
internationally.
because we actually, if you look at the board of the people on the APA, like the Psychiatric Association that made the DSM,
Mm-hmm.
like 70% of them are very, very entrenched and have strong relations with big pharmaceutical companies. And so there's a lot of psychologists who are being like, no, like this is obviously catering to like over medicating and like relying more on pharmaceuticals than we are comfortable with. There's a big cleave between like psychologists and psychiatrists sometimes. We absolutely like work together,
Mm-hmm.
um, but it definitely can be like a contentious relationship sometimes.
Sure. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. Um, so yeah, just off of everything I heard even just yesterday and stuff, I think that there's like a lot of validity to clarifying psychological science up for people because I think there's a lot of misinformation that is completely understandable why like lay people would have this misinformation because it's regularly delivered, especially on social media. I mean, I was pretty
Mm-hmm.
appalled when I got into social media and psychology and
Holy
like
shit.
yeah, and like seeing the information and the things that people advocate for is just like cringe. It's just really
Okay.
cringe and really frustrating. And then finally, we can also talk about IQ because I know that that is just a really contentious area in uh,
Everything.
pop culture, which
Yeah.
is interesting because it's not really contentious in research psychology at all. We just like don't really talk to people about it because we know everyone gets really mad about it. So we just try to like not mention it.
Okay, wait, let's start there. When it's not really contentious, what do you mean by that?
So in IQ is just an unquestionably validated measure. Um,
Okay, never mind. All right.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. This is always what I've said. Yeah. It's one of those things like people in pop science want to fight a lot about whether or not like, well, is it racially biased? Does it select for certain things? Blah 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 blah.
Yeah.
And there might be like legitimate arguments to have there, but and I hate to say this, and I'm not trying to sound like, well, actually, I'm not an elitist because I've never had my IQ test. I don't even know, right? But it seems unquestionable that having like a second or like a first or second deviation off the IQ, like being above, is like one of the greatest predictors of success in life. It is just so unbelievably important, and it's correlated with so many positive outcomes that
Right.
the idea that that number is just fake or doesn't mean anything, it's that's only a political opinion, in my opinion. It seems to be the case.
Yeah. That's good to know. I actually didn't know. I had a bunch of my like followers and people be like, "You got to talk to Destiny about IQ." And then I tried to like I looked through like hours of your stuff, like anything that might be about IQ, and I just like couldn't find a clear picture about what you thought
Hmm.
about IQ. So I
Hmm.
wasn't really sure where precisely to start, like where if I would need to convince you that IQ is at least because my argument is basically if you don't believe IQ is a valid scientific measure, you basically probably shouldn't believe in most psychological findings, excluding
Hmm.
like recidivism studies, because those have
Yeah.
equal numbers of data points to IQ, maybe.
Yeah,
Um,
it's just like it's just something that's just so heavily empirically like studied, and then so like the all the correlative things are. Initially, I didn't want to because for politically, there's a lot of good reasons not to want to believe that that
yes.
measurement might be important. But man, it's impossible to escape that much data around it, in my opinion. Or when I was digging through, because I did a lot of like, have you ever heard of like race realism or anything?
Yes, yes. I spent
Hmm.
a number of hours this past week after we decided to chat
Hmm.
informing myself on what they say because obviously they're not really popular in academic
Hmm.
psychology, right? So we just kind of are like,
Sure.
they're stupid and they absolutely abuse the science, and then we kind of move
Hmm.
on. So yeah, I have heard of them, but I'd be
Yeah.
curious your thoughts on them.
Yeah, I mean, we can get into that. The easiest way to get rid of all of it is just say that IQ doesn't matter, though. But then if you dig through stuff, it seems hard to make that argument. So you have to go from different angles, I guess. That's the only reason why I've done any reading related to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, or do you want to talk about race realism more? Or what? Or sorry, we're bouncing all over the place. What
Yeah,
do you want to
sure. Why don't we
buckle
start
down at
with
the end?
yeah, let's start with race realism. Mostly because I was looking through some research again the other day, just as I was kind of reading through. I was looking through JF stuff and
Wait, how long have you been like an internet like watcher person?
I would say my husband always makes the joke that if you can't date a gamer girl, you make one.
Okay.
Only more recently, like I'm definitely not like a big internet person. Before
Uh-huh.
that, I was definitely like a very classic white middle class academic type.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, so the fact that I know about JF and stuff is because I've just probably spent a lot of time trying to like understand what
Okay.
race realists say, and he's probably like there's a lot of race realists that are just like terrible and but they don't
Hmm.
also make sense, whereas JF at least like knows a little bit about statistics and science. He just like really abuses it. um,
Yeah. The
yeah, and then
stereotypes, but okay.
yeah, he abuses the scary parts. And then I looked at like I think the guy's called like the alternative hypothesis. He's just got a
Yeah.
bunch of articles about IQ, so I just like looked through them to be like, okay, what are they saying
Hmm.
and how are they like misrepresenting it? um, yeah, so I can maybe start you on there if you'd like, if you have any questions maybe about like why they're wrong.
Yeah, maybe. Or yeah, where do you want to? I don't know how. I don't know. I don't know where our opinions are going to differ. I guess. Where do you want to start? Tell me wherever you want to start. You're the expert. Okay. I'm
That's a
just
good
the.
question.
Yeah.
I mean, I had no idea where our opinions would differ. So I'll maybe start by saying I think almost all constructs of that race realists use are definitely like there's an empirical backing to it, but the biggest
Hmm.
issue within race realist argument is they can't prove that the same genetic markers that inform what racial phenotypic expression you might have are in
Hmm.
any way related to your cognitive ability, uh,
Hmm.
polygenic expression, right? So that what they have to prove is that the genes for like race determinism overlaps with cognitive ability.
So
And
would that mean like so essentially so a lot of people like to talk about using like GWASs to determine like ethnicity and stuff. You would have to prove that the same genes that you're selecting for to talk about variations in ethnicity are also part of the collection of genes that we've identified as having a causal or at least a correlative impact on intelligence or IQ.
yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And so one of the best ways you can check for this, it's a study that came in about 2020, and I'm so glad I found it. And I'm sure
Hmm.
race realists were real pissed when they saw it. Is a really good way to test for this. So they'll use like twin studies a lot, and the reality is twin
Yeah.
studies don't actually tell you that the genes for race and intelligence are the same, right? They just
Hmm.
tell you that genetics are important for intelligence and cognitive ability, and that's true. Like we do know that, right? It's
Hmm.
by the time you're an adult, it's about like zero point 0.8 to zero point 0.7 um, heritability. So it's pretty important.
Hmm. Even on the something that's really confusing for me, and it's hard to wrap my head around this. Measuring heritability seems very difficult. Because when we're talking about the heritability, or we'll say more specifically, maybe the genetic inheritance of a trait, like ideally, like any good measurement is going to have some level of controls. But like if you control for enough, you're always like every control necessarily increases the heritability of any particular thing. Do you know what I'm talking about? How do you wrap your head around this? Or does what I'm saying make any sense?
I think so. Basically, like as you control for like removing like uh, making sure like the twin studies where they stay in the same house. Now they've got the
Hmm.
same genes and they also have common environmental. So you've kind of controlled for the common environmental. Is that
Hmm.
kind of what you're getting at? So therefore,
Kind
more
of.
weight of
So
variance is going to be placed back on the genetics.
yeah, so basically, my understanding is heritability says what percentage of the difference between a trait can be measured solely based on genetic influence.
Okay,
I
yeah,
believe,
that's a good
right?
question. Yeah.
Yeah, and then but then the thing is that like if we control for every single possible variable, well then the heritability of everything necessarily rises to one. Well, the only thing that's going to be left to explain the difference is going to be genetic. So how do you like how do you even begin to approach like breaking down how that number is studied or how you would get? Yeah, sorry, yeah, go for it. I don't know if that question made sense or not. Yeah.
Yeah, it's complex because the issue with humans is that you can never like perfectly control. That's why like fundamentally psychology has to be regarded as a soft science, not because like psychologists are stupid and they can't do good science, but because you can't put humans in a vat and then only expose them to certain conditions to see how it goes. We have ethics for that, right? We can't do that. And unlike a physicist who can just take a like an electron and like splat it against a wall. We can't like take a human and just like throw them into a traumatic situation and be like, I wonder what will happen, right?
Yeah.
So the reality with psychology is it's always going to be correlational, and so we can never purely pull it apart. The main thing is, so when we do, it might be helpful to just kind of explain how we study variance, at least within kind of biopsychology. So we kind of look at variance in three levels. We look at genetic heritability, then we look at common environment, and then we look at unshared environment, right? And so the twin studies where they stay together in the same home controls for genetic heritability and common environment, right? And so the differences that we see, we can be like, it's probably due to unshared environment. If you have twins that are monozygotic that are then separated at birth, then we have just genetic heritability because they don't have a common environment and no one shares the unshared environment because that's just like your personal lived experience. So
One
that,
thing for the and then one other thing I'll bring up.
yeah.
So I'm bringing these up because this is what I've learned, and then you can tell me if I'm right or wrong. I used to. Do you know who Robert Sapolsky is?
No.
Okay, big. I think a lecturer at Stanford. I watched through a lot of his courses, so I'm repeating a lot of information that he said. So if I ever say anything dumb, I blame him. Okay.
Oh, I do know him actually. I love his lectures.
Oh.
Yeah,
okay.
I watch him a fair bit too.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
Okay.
he's great.
So when I was going into the race realist thing, twin studies are like the god tier. These are like your best. They're so good. They're perfect. They do everything. And then something that I started to learn a little bit more is that actually twin studies can run into, there's two big problems I remember. One is that it's not true that a shared environment begins post-birth. There can be a shared environment prior to birth in the womb. That is an environment that can have an impact on the developing fetuses. And two, that twin studies can be a little bit difficult sometimes because an adoption home environment is going to be substantially different than the average like normal home environment. For instance, like there's a high selection criteria for adopting a child versus just having a child. Anybody can have a child, but if you want to adopt a child, that's a much more arduous process. So there can be like a lot of interesting selection that goes on there where people in adopted homes might outperform unadopted people, not necessarily for any, just that it gets more complicated to measure this. Does that make any sense what I'm saying there?
Oh yeah, totally makes sense.
Okay, gotcha. I'm just making sure I'm not. If I'm repeating this, I'm just making sure I'm not like misunderstanding. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and those are super valid critiques of twin problems, and this is why. Have you ever heard anybody talk to you about like confidence intervals? Like, are you familiar with that language, a confidence interval?
Yes, I think so. Like, isn't a 95% confidence interval means that like 95% of the time the results are going to fall within? It's like a standard deviation or something like this. I don't remember exactly, but
yeah,
high confidence interval good means data is more likely to be in the area that you say that it is, or something.
Yeah, and so usually when we report on things, the confidence interval is basically the number of possible options that are true. So we say the heritability based on these twin studies, by the time they're 21 is 0.8, right? Race realists are going to report on the 0.8. Most scientists are actually going to talk about the confidence interval, though. They're going to talk about the like 0.7 to like 0.83, right? They're going to talk about the range that we find that's within that 95%, because what we do in science with statistics is we basically try to reduce the likelihood of certain types of errors, and then we prioritize. But that means that basically we try to prioritize. I always get these wrong. We try to prioritize somebody if you're in your comments. I know that there's a couple of like statistician type people, because it's like a bunch of false positive, false negatives. There's like type 1 errors and type 2 errors. And in science with the confidence interval, we try to minimize one of those. I believe it's false positives, which means we can have a million potential false negatives. We'd rather get a non-finding, but it actually technically be true, we just artifacts of our studies it came out as a non-finding, then get a finding that we see as true and it turns out it's fucking false when we try to replicate it. So
Sure.
that's what the confidence interval is. It's like we're 95% confident and it's within this range. This is what the correlation is, within this range, basically. And race realists really like to just report like the correlational number rather than the confidence interval, which is really important. So that confidence interval in part accounts for the fact that there are problems with twin studies inherent, which is why when we like talk about heritability, we have to be really careful of being like, it's within this range, but the reality is as more science comes out, it is actually likely to shrink, not grow, because we know that environment is so important for genetics. And then we discovered epigenetics and we're like, well, shit, not only is environment just like interacting with nature, nurture naturally, but environment can actually turn on genetic expressions, which is just adds like a whole like additive component to the nature nurture. And so
Yeah.
what I find with most psychological studies is as we get more data, the heritability of things actually trend lower. So something like IQ still having like a heritability of like 0.5 to 0.6 right now is really significant. That's a big deal because it has trended lower over time.
Sure. That was one of the big things that I learned in diving through those things that you kind of mentioned was eliminating in my head. In school, you come out in like high school, you come out with a very strict idea that there's like nature versus nurture. And I think eliminating that distinction in my head helped me understand a lot of stuff related to genetics more because it's so much more complicated than that. When you talk about like transcription factors, you talk about epigenetic things, that genes are turned on or off by the environment. And there is no such thing as a gene that exists independent of environment. It doesn't make sense to even talk about that. So that's something that I think helped me wrap my head around some of this information a little bit more as well.
Yeah, and it's just really complex and it's hard because like this isn't really sexy conversation, right? Like lay people a lot of time are just like, I just don't fucking care. It's really complex to explain, and like part of our job
I want
is,
the gay gene or the genius gene, like the one thing that is what people look for sometimes.
What is it? Just put your finger on it. And I'm like, there's billions of genes and there's epigenetic interaction. So like, I don't know, it's polygenic. That's what we're gonna say over and over. But a really important thing, actually, that like I said, that came out in 2020. That's gonna really fuck with race realists. So it might be good just for you to know in the future if you're debating them. Is maybe I'll actually send you a link to this article as well. Do you know Sci-Hub first and foremost? Have you ever heard of Sci-Hub?
Yeah, wait, is that like it's hosted on Russian servers that you can use to illegally access studies behind paywalls?
Yeah, basically.
Yeah, okay.
It's amazing. I'm also going to send you a really great psychological page called Our Psychologist. Basically, what you can use, it's really like lay friendly. Because you can just like enter in different correlational coefficients and it'll interpret for you what that actually means, right? Like if you get a Cohen's d, you can just literally like I don't know if I can even stream to you. I'll share my screen. You can literally just go in here, right? So if you get a Cohen's d, a lot of people just like don't know what that means, but you can come into this website and just like literally plug in like Cohen's d of 0.5 and like pop it in there and it'll tell you what that actually means. So that means the group in the second group is at 63.8% more likely to be superior in whatever trait you're measuring, right? It's a super great website. I'm really pro like getting into the hands like lay people as much as possible because statistics is really complex. In fact, I have to take full courses on how to explain statistics to judges in forensic psychology. Yeah, so it's super understandable when people are like, I don't get it. I'm like, I've been doing stats for like 6 years and I barely get it, so it's fair.
Yeah, it does seem, it's like the one thing that I haven't done yet, but I probably need to, is to try to take like a 101 on stats or whatever. Because even for like basic things, like, can you explain like, what does it mean when something crosses the null? Is that good or bad? Like, I'll get so many people arguing about this and it's hard to figure out like who knows what they're talking about or who doesn't know what they're talking about. So there's like a lot of weird shit,
Yeah. And like sometimes, like depending on the day, like I said, like I was struggling with like type 1, type 2 errors, and it like took me a bit to get it. Like it's just, a lot of people are like, statistics is really like self-evident, and I'm like, no, statistics is like the most counterintuitive math ever. Like maybe that's just my personal experience, but I was always like just like banging my head against a wall. So yeah. So anyways, giving you this study, sorry, I'm getting distracted and excited because I really like science.
Love
and math.
stats.
I love stat. I don't love stats, but I love.
You're giving
what
me
they can
the
do for us.
Wolfram Alpha of stats sites. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I just got to pull up my document here. Okay, so this study is, I'm going to just check that it's the correct one. So it's from 2020. Just making sure that this is the, I have like a bunch of citations like prepped for our conversation, so. Okay, here you go. You can check that out. So basically this article is huge. If you look at, the most important thing to look at when you're looking at studies, especially for psychology, is you have to look at their N value first and foremost. Now, this is all about like the difference between qualitative and quantitative. We don't have to necessarily get into that today because it's like a whole other conversation. But when you're studying things like IQ, you want to definitely be starting with quantitative studies because those are where you get your generalizations. And now obviously you can't use generalizations to inform you about individuals, but it is predictive of individuals within a group. So this N on this study, I don't know if you pulled it up, is massive. You've got 84,000 whites, 37,000 black people, and 17,000 Hispanics. So really large, basically showing you not only have we well passed, there's something called the central theorem limit, where you need to have a sample size greater than 30 before you can really say that the statistic finding is significant and somewhat generalizable. The larger
Can you
the
give me a
population,
link in Discord real quick about this so that I can link it to my chat?
the actual article?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I sent it to you in our Discord chat. It's the second one, the Sci-Hub link.
Well, I think you screen shared with me, but I don't think you actually sent me the link.
It is in our Discord chat right now between us.
Test. Oh shit! I think Discord is having problems.
Okay.
Is the text grayed out for you right now? If you type to me, or can you type messages to me?
I can type messages. Let me just pop into your actual. I've got you pulled up on another screen on the side. Let me just pop into your chat and post it for them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wait, are you sure you can send me? I don't think you can send me messages right now.
They're coming up red, so they actually aren't
it's
coming.
not working right now.
Okay, let me send it in your thing. So here's the article, guys. I just posted it, Not So Erudite. It's the Sci-Hub link. If you want the Cohen's D.
Okay.
Give me 2 seconds. I'm working on 2 computers because I don't have 2 screens yet. Because I am a noob. Okay. Here you guys go. Here's the here's our psychologist if you ever want to like understand Cohen's D. I just posted it. Hopefully your chat can get it. I know it moves pretty quick, so
no, it should be fine.
I can repost if they need it. But yeah, so there's the article. It's a really, really big study. It's really important. I mean, it's in intelligence is a very big journal, so it's a big study. And they've got really good peer reviewers. So in general, like with certain, again, we're getting into kind of academic land and understanding academic land, but intelligence is, you can always tell if a journal is good based on basically they have like citation sizes that are computed for them. You can actually just Google it. And
so if you go on Google Scholar, it might say like this article's been cited, or this study's been cited like 100 times or 2,000 times or something, or 2 times or something, right?
So there's that, but then you can also check the actual journal, because the journals are going to have peer reviewers, and higher quality journals are going to only be publishing higher quality science, right? Which is why if you get something from like a random obscure like journal of like feelings, emotions, and like puppy dogs, right? I'm not going to trust necessarily the science in that article as much as I'm going to trust something from like Nature, which is like the most prestigious thing. So you can just Google like journal intelligence, and it should come out of like basically their there we go, their impact factor. So like 2.77 is a pretty solid impact factor. That's good.
Okay.
And then you can compare it to like Nature as your like golden standard. What's their impact factor? 49.96, right? So tells you a little bit. It's unsurprising.
Although to be fair, also though, just to be clear, even these journals can make big mistakes sometimes, because I think like the Lancet probably has a high impact factor, I would imagine, right?
I don't know. I'll just throw it in here.
For medical stuff? Fuck, I hope so, unless I'm just making shit up.
They have they have a large impact factor.
Yeah, but I think The Lancet was the journal that published the initial study about like vaccines causing autism. And they also messed up over the coronavirus. They published a really big study related to it was some drug or something that had a high efficacy, but I think that the data sets were either false or just non-existent for the company that submitted it. But yeah, yeah. But anyway, yeah, okay. But generally, reputable journals are better than random as fuck journals that anybody can post, or God forbid, where we exist now, the preprint cycle where there is no journal. There's just people publishing their studies directly to the internet. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So, anyways, going into the study, the big thing is that they looked at the heritability between the races. So they they separated the study by saying, is the heritability of IQ different among the races? Because if they are different, that probably suggests to us that the genes that inform racial expression also inform cognitive expression. That would make sense. Whereas if they have statistically similar heritability rates, that suggests to us that probably the genes that code for what bone structure, the melanination of your skin, has nothing to do with the genes that code for your intelligence, which means you can't use race as a standard being like, oh, well, of course black people are just less intelligent, right? You can't use that claim. So this study is great because basically it says absolutely not. It's in this last line in the actual abstract. At least in the United States, race, ethnicity, heritability interactions do not exist. They are completely non-significant. So that tells us absolutely, beyond a doubt, at least within the States, it would be weird that it would happen in the States and not elsewhere, but they're being like empirically conservative.
Gotcha.
There's
I would
no evidence
so
of racial intelligence crossover in genetics.
I might be a big baby, or maybe you're educated, or I'm not sure, but I always caution against using really extreme language like that, especially because intelligence is so amazingly polygenetic. I feel like there's probably still room to fight over whether or not it's heritable genetically, because I feel like there would be other grounds that people would fight you on. So, for instance, like some people might challenge like how race was constructed in a given study. Whereas somebody might say like, well, they were measuring just between black and white people, but we would use a GWAS to establish other ethnicities, and we'd be more precise with how we would establish race, and then maybe we would see something. I always get scared when people talk about intelligence and people want to throw around the word. I'm not that you're doing this, but like the idea like, oh, well, we absolutely know this particular thing. It seems that everything related to intelligence is still like pretty up in the air in terms of like the genetic impact, the environmental impact, on how much this is like from person to person or whatever.
Yeah, to an extent. And I think that that's like a good conservative go-to. I just think like this study by itself really, it's a really good study just for reading. Like their introduction itself is really well written. It really kicks in the knees of race realists. And obviously the problem with anyone who's got like an ideological motivation for their belief is it doesn't matter what science. They're always going to find issues with anything. That's just the nature of science and humans. But I would say like as somebody who is like absolutely IQ is valid, but absolutely it doesn't necessarily validate racial claims. This is a really important study because of that, basically.
True. Also, hold on. I just want to say something in chat. Okay, I fucked this up a lot, so tell me if I fuck this up. So somebody in chat says, height is highly polygenetic, or height differences in the U.S. mostly due to genes or environment. So this is very important. Heritability does not tell you how much of a trait is genetically influenced. I think heritability tells you how much the difference in a given trait in a population is genetically influenced, which I think is very different. So I'm trying to remember if I have an example that's correct here. Like you can have something that is almost 100% like a genetic thing that you get, like a height, but the heritability might be very low because differences in the environment are accounting almost completely for the differences that you see in height. So for instance, like malnutrition might be the main reason why somebody grows to a certain size or not. So even if a trait is highly genetically determined, I think it can still have a very low heritability. Is that correct? Am I understanding that correct? Or
Honestly, I haven't really heard that ever in school. That doesn't mean that like that isn't true necessarily. It's possible I haven't been exposed to that idea. Usually in general when we talk about it, it's we really do talk about it how well do differences in people's expressions are they accounted for by their genes? That's usually how
well, you
we
just said the
think.
differences in expression, yeah, but not like is the thing itself 100% determined by genes or environment, but how much of the difference can be explained by the genes.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So
Mhm.
this is kind of like the issue of trying to understand statistical language versus like how
Mhm.
lay people use it.
Yeah.
Because, and this is like an issue we get into even like trying to explain to a judge of being like, well, are they going to reoffend? And we're like, well, we have like predictive validity saying like there's a point 0.8. And they're like, well, what does that mean? And you're like, well, like if you took a bunch of people from the pot and you like try to explain, it's really complex to explain. I mean, I'm
Mhm.
definitely not the most gifted, I think, at explaining statistics,
Mhm.
because it's not something that I find people who are like really dominant at it are going to do better
Mhm.
than others.
I think that like height is highly predicted by genes, right? That's a pretty big thing genetically that height comes from. Yeah.
Sorry, I got distracted by something. Can you restate that?
Height is highly predicted by genes,
I believe
right?
so.
Like,
I
yeah.
believe so. I'm
So,
definitely not like I'm really
mhm.
specialized into psychology, so I wouldn't really
Gotcha.
comment too much on
Yeah, I understand.
biology.
I
But
understand.
yeah, I believe
Just
so.
for
That
sake
would
of an
make
example, so
sense.
like if you have like twins and the heights between twins are incredibly varied, and I'm talking about the monozygotic, whatever the ones come from the split egg, the identical twins,
Yeah.
um, the genetic determination of that trait can be very, very, very high. But if it's the fact that the environment is what's causing the variation, we would say the heritability of that trait, I think, is low because the variation in height from person to person is largely explained by environment, even if the trait itself is highly genetically determined. Does that language make sense? Am I using that correctly?
Yeah, that does make sense. I guess I would
Okay, yeah.
bringing it back to the study because I'm seeing like a lot of
Hmm.
people in my comments and stuff being like, I don't understand how this is like destroying the argument of like the race realists.
Hmm.
The heritability obviously varies, right? If you get a point 0.6, it says it's influencing the differences by about point 0.6, right? Which
Hmm.
doesn't mean that it's one on one. It means that there is a whole bunch of other factors that are influencing it. And I'm going to really simplify the language. So if people are like, that's not precisely, it's like, of course it's not. I'm trying to really
Hmm.
simplify here. If the heritability is the same across multiple races, of in a meta-analysis study that has over 10,000 data points, if there's no statistical variance on one trait of heritability of IQ, that strongly suggests that there is no overlap of the genes that are going to inform racial expression as compared to the genes that are going to inform cognitive ability expression, right? The fact that there's no difference in the heritability suggests very strongly that there isn't a strong relationship between race and intelligence because the study is so large, and if in any way the genes that were influencing racial expression overlapped with cognitive expression, we would necessarily expect to see some statistical difference in heritability. That's kind of the implication of this study. Does that make sense to people or to yourself? Is that making sense again?
Um, I think so. I'm going to try to. I'm going to reform it and say it back at you. Tell me if you think I understand what you're saying. Um, if it was the case that genes were predictive of intelligence, the same genes that control for race were controlling for intelligence. If that was the case, then it would be the case that we would expect to see uh, it when we measure IQ and race, that we would expect to see among different groups of people or subgroups of people, different ethnicities, we would expect to see different heritabilities of their IQ if the same genes that were controlling for race were also controlling for intelligence.
Yes.
Why wouldn't it be the case that it could still be the genes could still be controlling for intelligence, but the heritability would still be similar? Why wouldn't that be the case?
Okay. Can I go on cam with you and just draw a picture? It might be
Go for it.
easier
Yeah.
that stats is really hard to explain without
Mm-hmm.
pictures. Okay. Let me just change over how I'm streaming because
Mm-hmm.
again. Okay.
And then can you go and watch? Not so erudite.
Hold on. I just got to.
Oh man, you have your whole Discord up there. Whew. Be careful.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
You're a warrior.
I'm trying to figure out how to get my camera to turn on for Discord again.
Camera probably isn't going to work because you're using it for stream, but shared screen will work.
Okay. Shoot. If you can just watch me even on my stream, I think that'll be easier rather than me just like out.
Yeah, that's fine. I got your stream on the background now.
Okay,
So I'm
perfect. Okay, let's go back to here. Okay, so I'm gonna use a black pen so you guys can see it better. Not because we're talking about racial differences, just so that that's clear. Okay, I'm gonna use just 3 genes. So there's a couple of possibilities. So okay, so say we've got this. Say there's an overlap between this is race and this is, let's just say, IQ. Okay, race and IQ. Say there's a small overlap. Say we've got genes A and B. These genes inform the heritability of the racial expression. And then you've got C and D that inform IQ. But then there's an overlap of E. This gene informs both race and IQ. And now those are all going to go towards heritability. What we would expect to see if this was the case is that heritability across races should differ, because the E is going to have to differ to inform the race and inform the IQ. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so let's say that we had a gene. Let's say that we had a gene that was making us really smart. We would expect that that gene would have a higher probability of existing in white populations versus black populations, I'm assuming, for a race realist, right? So if that gene does differ from one population to another, we would expect the heritability accordingly to change, because there's a gene that's controlling for something polygenetic there, or something polyphenic there, or whatever, right? There's some phenotypical change.
Yes.
But if everything is the same across the board, then it seems to be the case that that gene E or whatever probably exists in both of these populations, and the things that are determining the difference of phenotype for race doesn't seem to be the things that are determining the difference of phenotype for intelligence, right?
Right, because the E is overlapping, so necessarily the heritability should change across races.
Sure.
It might not change a ton, but it should statistically change. It might be like 0.64.
We would expect it to. It not necessarily. It could be the case that there is like a variety of genes that exist in black people and white. It could be like, there's always the possibility, right? I like to caveat very carefully. So, but we would generally expect to see to be the case that
Yes. Whereas what this study shows is, I gotta put race and IQ. What this study shows is that race and IQ genetically look like this. This is what it strongly suggests. Obviously, it could be wrong, but the fact that heritability, cameras just make me get all messed up. The fact that heritability didn't vary across race suggests that there's no gene overlap between the factors that predict the race expression that you're going to have and the genes that predict the intelligence expression that you're going to have. Does that make sense? The difference? Basically, the hypothesis was, is it this picture or this picture? Right? That was the hypothesis. Race realists argue it's this. Okay?
Sure.
This is what the study found.
Sure, okay.
So that's why this is a really big kick in the knees to race realists, because it suggests pretty strongly one of their main things. It's why they're using twin studies all the time, is they're trying to say this. They're trying to say the overlap of genes. There is an overlap between genes that inform race and genes that inform IQ. That's why there's racial differences in IQ. And this study that I just cited you says absolutely not.
Or it doesn't seem to be the case.
It doesn't seem to be the case. And like it's a really strong study. It's a really strong study. A race realist would need to come out with another study that's got even larger statistical numbers. It's got excellent IQ testing. It's controlling for a lot of things. Like the study is if you look through the methodology, which I'm not going to go through because it's boring, but the methodology of the study is really solid. So you would have a really hard time. This is what we would probably call like a landmark study. Like this is kind of like in science, we kind of go like, yeah, this is more or less where we proved this thing. And there's landmark studies all the time that we just kind of refer back to and being like, yeah, this is where more or less in forensic psychology, we've got like, we call them the central 8. There's these 8 static factors that predict if somebody's going to reaffect crime. And there's this like landmark study in like the 1980s that came out that was just massive. It just dumpstered everyone else's arguments, and then people just kind of stopped arguing about Central 8 after that. They were like, meh, yeah.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Whew. Explaining statistics is my greatest academic nightmare. Because I'm a psych student, I'm not a statistics pure student, so I'm definitely not like as versed at the language of it. Okay, so another really big thing that I think people use, at least for race realism, is they try
Hmm.
to look at the differences. I don't know if you've ever seen, like, if you Google like IQs across countries.
Yes.
That's another really big thing that they'll try to use, at least from what I have seen. Would you say that that's correct in the race realists that you have talked to?
Yeah, hold on. 1 second. I try to responsibly caveat all of my how strong I feel like, oh, this study may blah 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 blah. I think there are good ways that you can caveat, and I think there are ways that you cannot caveat. Somebody in chat just said, don't big landmark studies need funding from people who want a specific result? That might be true sometimes, but like if a study is published in a peer-reviewed journal, if you want to take issue with the study, assuming it's a highly reputable journal, you can't just say, oh, well, look who funded this. You know, it's the Jews or whatever crazy, whatever bullshit you want to believe. You have to be able to attack the merits of the study. You can't just say, oh, well, look who funds it. Otherwise, you're in conspiracy land. You can't trust any journal, any study about anything. It's the dumbest fucking criticism to make of any particular study. Is you just go, well, look who funded it. You can attack the methodology. You can attack who published it, but like you can't just say, look who funded it and say, therefore, it's wrong. Okay. Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
Plus, to add to
Go
that,
to the
if
next
you
one.
look at the actual
Okay.
study I cited,
Mhm.
the number one author is from a university, which means they probably got their funding from a government grant. Because
Sure.
governments actually give research grants all the time, and this is a
Mhm.
really good study. So this likely
Mhm.
won a major like national government grant. I don't know, but probably.
Yeah. Something that I am seeing a few people say, and I don't want to get like too deep into like we're going to do a 3-hour discussion on race realism, or I don't know if that's where you want to go with this. But I do see,
Not definitely my favorite topic, just because I want to make it clear I'm very opposed to that. I think that's terrible. No.
So there are people in chat saying that this study is commonly cited by race realists, though, to bolster their claims. I don't know if that's true or not, or I'm not sure. I don't follow this stuff as much anymore because I haven't debated this in a while. But
Sorry, they use what to bolster their claims?
apparently people cite, there are race realists that cite this study to bolster their claims that
That would
heritability
be-
not varying across races is an argument that's being used for race realism.
I don't know how they would. I guess I would have to be exposed to that argument. I don't exactly know how they would argue that, other than me. Like, if I heard that, I would be like, yeah, but that doesn't make any sense. So if they have this specific argument, but it doesn't really make sense to me. I can't imagine how they construe it, because the very, like, literally the abstract in itself says ethnicity heritability interactions do not exist, and I guess they'd say, well, that's proving it, but it's like, I don't
Okay,
know
wait,
how.
never mind. Okay. Okay, I'll look at this later. This is different. I see who's making this quiz now. Okay, go for it. Go for it. What was the next thing you want to talk about?
Ooh, I just lost my train of thought. I just wanted to clarify some differences that we see between countries, because I think that that's
Go
another
for it, yeah.
big one that gets brought up a lot.
Mhm.
So a really common thing that I see is if you Google like who's smarter in which country, you see like, oh, like Canada's 4 IQ points above America and stuff like this. The main thing is you can find none of this data on peer-reviewed journals. Usually the people who are doing these studies do really bad science. So in most of the Google articles I've seen, they don't even declare the IQ measure that they're using. Anyone who's using an IQ measure that was developed in Canada with Canadian culturally based questions is going to be doing terrible science if they try to bring that to Iranians and ask them, being like, who's the Prime Minister of Canada? They're going to be like, I don't know, right? But you'd expect a Canadian student who's grown up and lived in Canada and been exposed to
hold on.
Canadian education.
I'll push back on this a little bit. My understanding is that IQ tests don't ask trivia questions. No, I thought IQ tests were mainly pattern recognition things.
They do something that is called comprehension, which is going to basically test. It's a subtest that doesn't get used very often, but if we suspect that there is a learning disorder going on in a child who has been exposed to a Canadian education, we could use this test to basically say, are they acquiescing the information that they should be because they've been exposed to these things? So there are actually trivia questions. We just barely use them. It's not in the like standard gambit that we use. There's about 23 subtests we can give. Usually we give about 10. And it's not in the
Gotcha.
standard
Okay.
gambit. Yeah.
So you're saying that it might be the case that in a given society, just because of the society that you're in, you will have been exposed to some questions that it's not supposed to necessarily be testing for a cultural thing, but there could be some cultural overlap.
Yeah. Another
Okay.
big one would be if you've got a culture that's highly oral in nature, um,
Hmm.
you're going to have to adapt tests to them and um, try to basically like, I'm trying to figure out how to explain this. So if you have a culture that's really verbally based, um, and relies more on kind of oral tradition to pass on knowledge, you're
Hmm.
not going to expect them to do nearly as well on tests that might be more reading comprehension based, right? That would be an
Gotcha.
unfair test because we'd say, oh well, they didn't do nearly as well, and they're like, yeah, but culturally they barely use reading; they do mostly oral tradition, right? So that's not a
Hmm.
good measure of if this person's intelligent. It's a measure of this person hasn't been exposed to reading very often. Does that kind of make
Gotcha.
sense? Or vocab is another one. So vocab is a common thing that we'll test. It's basically, have you been exposed to common language within your dominant language? If you're using a Canadian test, obviously, even if it's converted into the Iranian language, common vernacular in Canada isn't going to be the same common vernacular, even in Iranian, in Iran,
Hmm.
right? That would be a really
Sure.
silly
Okay, that makes sense.
translation. And so most of the studies that I've seen, that I should say,
Hmm.
I should put big air quotes, studies, is just bad research. They don't state the IQ test that they're using. They don't even state like uh, whether they're using different measures across. Is it like just language changed? Are they just like taking it, like what is it based on? Because the
Hmm.
norms that you use in each country should be based in the Canadian population usually. But as a psychometrician, anytime we release a new intelligence measure, so I'm trained dominantly on what's called a Wechsler intelligence test. That's the one I prefer to use. I like
Hmm.
it the most. They're coming out with a new edition of the Wechsler. I have to go and do extra training to re up myself, understand what the sample population is, right? So, a big issue that came out with the Wechsler test 5 for children in Canadian norms is the sample population that they had was actually friends and family of the researchers. And
Hmm.
so the norms were actually higher than they should have been. So it made it look like Canadian students were 7 IQ points above American students, but that's just because mostly, if you're interested in IQ and you're pursuing higher level education, it's quite likely that you're surrounded by family and friends who are also interested in those topics, who are also going to be more IQ inclined anyways. So it's going to skew your sample population. Whereas like
Hmm.
American numbers, which is actually what right now in testing, when I test using like the Wechsler, I use American norms because they're actually better. The sampling is just better, and it's not actually hard to tease it apart. I just like kind of look at it, and
Hmm.
so that's something to be really careful of as a psychometrician, and shows like there's absolutely failings within the IQ measuring um, institution that have to be corrected for.
Hmm.
And so that's why like people who do like self-reports on IQ or they fill out an IQ test online, I'm like, just so it's clear, those are absolutely not a valid IQ test.
Gotcha.
They're
It
fun,
kind of,
they're interesting,
yeah.
but they're not informative of your actual IQ.
This it reminds me a little bit of there's a nickname abbreviation for white college students. It's like it's not sick. It's like one word. But basically the idea is that like one potential problem with a lot of psych research. Oh, weird. Have you ever heard that before?
Weird. Walk me through it. I might have.
Um,
It feels familiar, but it's not
I'm
coming
not
to
going to be able to
mind.
remember. Yeah, basically the idea is that college, like if you want to know something from psychology, it's that we have a really good understanding of the mind of a college student because so much research can sometimes in college campuses focus on surveys done of college students. And the issue is that even without trying, it might be the case that for a lot of surveys, you're massively overrepresented on weird people, where weird is Western, educated, industrial, rich, and democratic.
Okay.
And then especially because so many surveys can happen on like college campuses and stuff, that you end up like overrepresenting for some things even if you're not necessarily trying to do it. Is like not to say like all of it is bunk or whatever, but like that's something that people have to keep in mind when they're doing some types of research.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say IQ testing, at least in the American norms, absolutely
Yeah.
don't do that. They're really good
Sure.
with how they sample, but it's
Hmm.
definitely an issue. It's why basically I argue if you don't trust IQ overall, there's some validity to that. But if you just say it's not science, then you
Mm-hmm.
probably shouldn't trust any psychological science, right? Because we're the most redundantly careful with it, right? As soon as it was
Mm-hmm.
realized that the Canadian norms were skewing, particularly at the bottom end of IQ, and reporting people as being lower than they actually were, right?
Mm-hmm.
That information really got moved through and trained to a lot of people, and now like most people just switched to using American norms. Not everyone necessarily, right? That's why it's an imperfect system, and
Mm-hmm.
absolutely there are major problems that happen with it. In part, I would argue because our society aggressively overvalues IQ. But
Wait. When you say overvalues IQ, you mean that IQ is genuinely really, really, really important, or that we pretend that it's important, but it's not as important as it is? What do you mean by that?
I would say that we attach like human value to IQ more so,
Okay,
right?
attach human value to. Okay, gotcha, gotcha.
Yeah. Right. So like if somebody said like if I say like, well, I'm working with an individual who has lower IQ, somebody's saying,
Mm-hmm.
well, what are you saying that they're dumber? And they say it in
Yeah.
this way of being like, so you're saying that they're dirty or lesser? And it's like
Mm-hmm.
nobody's saying that but you, right? You're the only one
Politically in the
saying that.
U.S., we just had a huge issue with somebody describing some workers as low skill, where people thought that that was a huge insult. So yeah, I understand what you're saying.
Right, and this is why IQ is really important because the reality is some people aren't as high in IQ, and in my
Mm-hmm.
mind, I'm like that. Just so that's it's clear, that doesn't predict your quality of a parent. That doesn't predict whether or not you're going to be a good person or whether or not you're going to
Mm-hmm.
be a solid parent. It predicts if you're going to do super well in school and if you're going to kind of climb the somewhat capital system in North America, because North America really, really highly values IQ, and a
Mm-hmm.
lot of our institutes of like career and academia select for it, right? But you can be an excellent postman and not have a super high IQ, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
like, IQ matters, but it's certainly not the only metric of human functioning that matters to even be successful or like good. And that's
Sure.
my concern is placing like moral laden value on IQ, which I
Of
understand why
course.
people do it, but I want to discourage that.
Okay.
Okay. Right. I feel like we come to an understanding. Do you? I guess I'd open it. Do you have any other questions about IQ? Because I think a lot of people have a lot of like questions just about how IQ is tested, things like that. What's a valid measure of IQ? What's not? Do you have any questions around that? Or
I don't think so. A lot of things test for like general knowledge. It's like a vocab test might test your words, or like a math test might test how well you know math formulas. I think IQ tests are ideally trying to test for a more general intelligence, like how well can you recognize and solve for patterns, essentially. Um, and hopefully, how well does this correlate with some theoretical underlying like G value?
right?
Um, but I mean, I think I generally understand what an IQ test is or what it's supposed to measure for. I don't know if I have any other questions related to it.
Okay, yeah. It basically is a broad measure of general cognitive ability, right? It's your
Hmm.
ability to kind of problem solve, to acquiesce information, and then apply it in the
Yeah.
most successful way possible. Um,
Hmm.
but it definitely can be accounted for by other things. Like you can have really high IQ but never study and not do as well in school as somebody who has lower IQ
Hmm.
but studies a lot, right?
Hmm.
It's just going to tell you how quickly you're going to like acquiesce new skills and be able to like problem solve, and it absolutely is predictive of certain successes, right? Like
Hmm.
it definitely is important, but it's important because it means that like when people are handed in life like genetically or more often because of environmental factors lower IQ, we actually in our society that so strongly selects for IQ need to be absolutely offering people like that more supports, not because they are
Hmm.
lesser than, but because our society has become so highly complex and so high
Hmm.
IQ selective.
Just curious, how do you feel about Jordan Peterson?
Everyone always asks me this.
Uh
This
huh.
might be an area where we differ. I haven't watched almost any of his new stuff. I've watched like only one or two of his like podcasts since he kind of like went through that health thing and came back. So
Hmm.
I can't comment on like his present day stuff nearly as much. But I would say historically, I think Jordan Peterson is actually an excellent psychologist, and I think he definitely knows the science of psychology very well. Um,
Hmm.
and overall, I actually really like Jordan Peterson. I don't agree
Gotcha.
with every single thing he says, but I actually broadly like him.
Okay. I
Yeah.
broadly hate the fuck out of him.
Yeah, I know. So that's why I was like,
Anytime he talks about like anything related to history, sociology, politics, I think it's absolute fucking garbage. But anytime he talks about psychology, I don't think I've ever heard him say anything that is like, no way, that's totally incorrect or something.
mhm.
Um, I wish that he would have just stayed out of politics, because I do think that there are some conversations that he has that I think are valuable, that we shy away from in society, that are kind of important. And I'm sure he talks about IQ, or at least he used to before he got into these pop culture bullshit or whatever. And some of those conversations are really important to have. That, like, it seems like we prefer to bury our head in the sand and be like, oh no, IQ doesn't matter, blah 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 blah. Meanwhile, people in society that for whatever reason can attain a higher IQ are kind of fucked, as our society becomes more and more heavily skewed towards higher educated jobs. And if you aren't willing to recognize that as a lived reality, then you're not ever going to be able to solve for those problems. Which I think is kind of in line with what you were saying with, like, well, okay, if people do have low IQ for whatever reason, we need to have something in society to deal with this. We can't just expect these people to magically solve the problem on their own, because society is selecting more and more for kind of like higher IQ people because of the direction our economy is moving.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's like a legitimate stress for a lot of people who are like well versed on IQ and like
Mm-hmm.
looking at like jobs and life satisfaction, of being like,
Mm-hmm.
what do we do as our society becomes more complex? A lot of like more menial tasks are getting just replaced by factories and machinery, and that just
Mm-hmm.
creates less jobs, but it also selects for people having more complex jobs, which is managing the machinery, right? And
Mm-hmm.
managing the people managing the machinery.
Yeah.
And there's actually very legitimate concern, because there is a reality that like the IQ threshold for the workforce is steadily increasing,
Mm-hmm.
and that, I mean, that's why like somebody like me, like I'm pretty for UBI, because I think like it is necessarily where we have to go,
Mm-hmm.
right? But I'm also a person who would say like I don't tie a ton of like self-value to like just the work and like the things
Mm-hmm.
that I contribute to economy. I think like broadly our society is extended beyond that because of technology. Um,
Sure.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So, um, interesting. What about his? I'd be curious what like which historical takes of his that you like hate. I don't know if I'd push back today, just because I'd have to
Yeah.
think about it more.
Fuck.
But
I think talking about how like the Nazis were like atheists, and that was like a huge driving force of like what made them what they were, or I know he said other things in the past. I would have to go through and dig shit out. I just know that most of the time he dives into anything political, it makes me want to. It just I'm cringing out the window. His obsession with the C-16 shit in Canada, I think, is like generally like pretty dumb. Um, yeah, I don't know. I just literally, I would have to go through another Joe Rogan. Oh, I feel like he is. I feel like sometimes he is a little bit irresponsible with how he does conversations. Where if I say something is descriptive versus prescriptive, do you understand the difference between that?
um, I think
That
so.
like,
Yeah. But
yeah,
maybe just
he'll do
define it for
these.
us too.
Sure, he'll do these things where he'll lay out a whole bunch of descriptively true claims, and it seems like he's almost like implying the prescription, but he'll never say it, and then people will like accuse him of saying it, and then he'll get really like offended. So like I know he's had conversations before about like women in the workplace, and he'll say all these things about like, oh well, makeup does this, and we fight more now, and all this and that and that and that, but he'll never come out and like give a solution or even suggest a solution for it. He'll just list all these problems, and I think that's why his fan base tends to skew pretty far right sometimes, is because people will hear this like, oh well, damn, women need to get the fuck out of the workplace, obviously, based on what he's saying. But then when somebody confronts Jordan Peterson with like the obvious like end road of what he's saying, he'll always like, oh well, I didn't say that, I never ever said that, like, and it's like, okay, well, why don't, maybe it would be good to pair like a suggestion sometimes with what's going on, because it feels like it's really easy to take some of the descriptive claims you're making and run down a very scary prescriptive road. That's probably the biggest criticism I have of him sometimes, I think.
Okay, yeah, that makes
Hmm.
sense. Yeah, I could definitely understand that.
Hmm.
Especially like that was one of the main things I heard of his, where I was like, I've watched enough of his lectures and stuff that I could probably disentangle what he was actually implying. But
Hmm.
absolutely, I think people like less engaged with his work, or just like less thinking about it. The
Hmm.
words he uses, I think one big criticism I'd have of him, just like as a speaker, is he has a lot of like descriptive meanings for certain words that mean a lot to him that don't entirely match how common parlance uses it, like the word chaos, right? Like
Oh,
chaos is a
sure.
big word for him. It has a very specific meaning to him, but it's not quite how we use chaos here, right? Like chaos is a little bit negative in our culture, right? And so I can understand why he gets tired of having to like explain it all the time of what he means by chaos. But I do
Hmm.
think like there's a certain level of like responsibility as a public speaker, of like it is annoying to have to constantly re-explain, but you shouldn't
Hmm.
assume that everyone just knows what you're talking about, even if you're like
Yeah.
pretty well established.
Hmm.
Yeah. Um, well, I guess if we're pretty settled on IQ, I didn't know like where you're going to be at, so I probably over prepped a little bit.
Yeah, no
Um,
problem.
But if you don't have any like other concerns or questions about IQ, I could launch more into the stuff about the Iron Curtain of
Oh,
academic
yeah,
psychology a little bit more. Just I
go
think
for
that's
it.
a really important conversation, just even based on like recent events that have been like popping off in Twitch that you've
Hmm.
been involved in and stuff. I think it's really important to actually like clarify the science of psychology a lot. Um,
Sure.
so a lot of people aren't aware that there's a massive difference between a counseling psychologist and like a researching psychologist, right? It seems like you're deeply familiar with this at this
Yes,
point.
two fundamentally
Probably,
different things that
yeah,
counselors can fall into a lot of cognitive traps. Even for doctors, it's true,
yeah,
where like a doctor might have like a certain regimen and he feels like this works really well with patients, even though the research might say something different, and that you run into a lot of individual problems theoretically with counselors that have more on the ground experience with researchers that might be looking at larger sets of data sometimes, whatever. Yeah.
yeah. And so there's an issue where I find, at least on social media, there's a lot of like so in general, I'm pretty opposed to like academic elitism, and it feels weird to say this because in like I'm a pretty nice, pretty left-leaning person, but I think that
Hmm.
there needs to be some space for a certain level of like almost elitism within psychology because there's just a lot of really bad training institutes and rigor within psychology that
Sure.
started, I think, actually with good intentions, but
Hmm.
the effect that it's having is really concerning to me. So, for example,
Yeah.
in psychology, there's a big
I was
difference.
one real thing before you
Yeah,
get into it. A friend told me this. I was going to tweet this out, but I just decided not to. But this conversation broadly can probably describe it as like gatekeeping is good sometimes. Like there might be times where it's important, where there's actually a real value in gatekeeping certain topics from certain individuals because it's important to keep the conversations responsible and grounded in
yeah,
terms of like the evidence of the data. Yeah. All right,
yeah.
go for it.
That's a really good point, right? And I would say, like, with what we're seeing right now with mental health, it is beyond evident to me that psychology hasn't been careful enough,
Hmm.
right? Advocacy and kind of popularizing psychology really started blowing up, at least like in fields that I was hearing about. Like, a lot of people were talking about, like, how do we get like the common people to know about mental health and understand it. And the goal was to reduce stigma, right? It was a good
Hmm.
intention. And then we started putting in the hands of people lots of information about psychology, but we hadn't even worked out amongst ourselves as academics who actually was um, experts on things and who wasn't. And there was still kind of this like unspoken thing that everyone was just like too nice to address, right? Which is a lot of people who maybe had. Have you ever heard of a PsyD versus a PhD?
No, I probably heard of this before, but no, no. Tell me.
So a PhD, everyone kind of knows, it's a doctorate in philosophy. That's what almost
Hmm.
everyone gets,
Hmm.
including psychologists. And then a couple of psychological schools was like, hey, let's do a PsyD, which is a doctorate of psychology. Um, so it's a doctorate. It's just they're trying to equivocate it to a PhD. They're just going to
Hmm.
be like, but we're really specialized in psychology. Um, the problem is that a lot of PsyD programs, so there's different theoretical models of training in psychology. So if you go to
Hmm.
like a clinical psych program, usually, although I'm not sure what clinical psych program our one friend is in because I'm very confused by some of the things that said, but generally it has a scientist practitioner model.
One
That's
friend. Are you talking about the person that I talked to on stream about this?
yes.
Or are you talking about a person that I've had personal problems with on stream?
Yeah, like yesterday's drama.
Okay, never mind. Yeah, okay, gotcha. I'm
Yeah.
trying not to talk about that person right now, but okay, go for it.
Yeah, no, for sure. I'm just
I'm
clarifying.
trying to understand who you're talking about, but yeah, okay, I
Yeah, I'm
understand.
just
Okay, go for it.
clarifying because I'm going to kind of set clinical psych
Hmm.
as like a bit of a precedent, which
Hmm.
makes me nervous because I know that that individual identifies as a clinical psych, and
Sure.
I'm not really sure what to do with that basically. But
Okay.
basically, clinical psych programs usually have a scientist practitioner model, so they try to emphasize data, empiricism. They want to make sure that you know your research, you know your
Hmm.
methodology, and you understand statistics first and foremost before you're trying to help people.
Hmm.
And there were some really legitimate critiques brought forward by a PhD in counseling psychology. So that was kind of the next phase of psychology. And I think there was a really legitimate critique in that you got like a lot of really sciencey nerds. It's kind of the issue of like there's lots of really great doctors who know their science, but man, they're not great with people, right?
Sure.
And we were having a lot of these issues. As somebody who's like worked with both counseling psychologists and clinical psychologists, I'd broadly also agree. Like there's a lot of clinical psychologists and PhDs who just like will be like working with teens together, and like they're like,
Mm-hmm.
hey buddy, and they like clearly don't know how to talk to kids, whereas
Okay.
like a counseling psychologist might. So a counseling psychologist came in and they said, let's do more of a scholar practitioner model.
Okay.
Okay, and so this was more of an emphasis on like the art of human interaction. So they're less concerned with like rigid, high empirical quantitative data. They're more concerned with how do people at an emergent level operate? What do relationships look like? How do they engage with one another? And how do you support them in a healing journey? Right? That was like the big focus of it.
Okay.
And this started producing really excellent counselors, like legitimately excellent counselors.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is that those counseling psychologists started occupying certain roles that originally clinical psychologists were supposed to, in part because they were better with people. But then they started making scientific claims that they felt they were authorities on that sometimes weren't always entirely reflective of the actual science of psychology, or it was maybe old, right? It was kind of post dated because they'd been out of school for 10 years and they just didn't
Mm-hmm.
know that the science had been updated. And so that problem started happening a fair bit. And so there's a lot of clinical psychologists who were like, yeah, counseling psychologists are psychologists too, but with lots of implications. But nobody would say what those implications precisely were, other than being like, but they're not like as trained as us on empiricism, was kind of the implication a lot of the time. But nobody said it, right? Nobody wanted to
Mm-hmm.
like be mean in psychology. So we just kind of like, we're like, fine, you can be psychologist too. We'll just kind of like battle you in academic grounds sometimes. And like
Mm-hmm.
the researching psychologists would sometimes just get frustrated with practitioners, and practitioners vice versa would get frustrated being like, hey, these studies are like empirically sound but also like completely unrelated to how humans actually work, right? Which is a
Right.
valid critique both ways. Then CIDES happened, and I'm still not fully sure why they happened. It's not really clear to me like where it came from, why it got established. Um, but it really kind of tried to, I'm trying to think of how to say this. They took like a scholar practitioner model or a scientist practitioner model, and then they tried to make a practitioner scholar model, just to be nice and confusing.
Okay.
And so this model really emphasized, first and foremost, is the art of people, and after that is like the theories, right? And so a lot of times what I find with PsyDs is that they've done lots of practicums, they've worked with a lot of people, but they probably have the least rigorous amount of empirical um, training. Does that make
Okay.
sense?
Yes.
But again, because we're nice, nobody wanted to say that they're not psychologists, because they are technically licensed psychologists, right? And nobody's going to strip them of their like
Sure.
10 plus years of hard work, right?
Can I summarize what you've said so far, and you tell me if I'm understanding what you're saying?
Sure.
So, in psychology, um, we study empirical things, but people that study empirical things are usually losers and nerds who nobody wants to talk to. And so, having somebody go up to a patient and say, you know that if you continue this behavior, you're going to have a 42% chance of committing suicide, is not like a good one, right? So we have these people that are nice, that are therapists or counselors, or the other side of it, the clinical side of it. And these are the people that are better at like taking, ideally you have a model where you've got a group of people that are doing empirical research, and then they're from there giving recommendations how to treat people. And then you've got on the other side of it, a person that's like, okay, I'm going to take this information, I'm going to distill it down so that an individual can understand it. Yeah. And
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
the issue now is that the people that are on the clinical side have a new thing called a PsyD, where they can pretend to be both understanding the clinical side and the data side, but the data side they don't seem to have as good a grasp as they should on it if they're going to make those types of claims that they do have a good grasp on it. Is it kind of
Yeah, I've
okay?
never in the field broadly,
Mhm.
I haven't been overly impressed with PsyD achievers' empirical knowledge. I've been very
Gotcha.
dubious of it, and I've heard them making certain claims that reflect a lot more of pop psychology than actual
Mhm.
academic psychology, and that really concerns me because there's a lot of people in pop psychology that aren't even in the field of psychology. They're like social workers and stuff like that, and it's
Yeah.
like you shouldn't really be claiming yourself to be an expert on psychology if you're a social worker, because you're not. You're
Hmm.
definitely, even if you're a clinical social worker, I would still argue you're not a specialist in psychology, which is, again, I'm just like stepping on the toes of everyone in my field just slightly,
Hmm.
just to make as many enemies as possible. But I think it's a really legitimate concern, because then when lay people look at the field, who do they look to as saying what's actually true, right?
Hmm.
If I Google something um, like abuse, right? If I
Hmm.
Google abuse with Google, I'm going to come up mostly with pop psychology, almost exclusively, right?
Yeah. So this is academics' fault.
Hmm.
I will largely say I think that academics need to do a way better job at communicating common ideas to other people. Otherwise, you will always find yourself at the mercy of whatever pop figure decides to do this. This happens in every single field, I think,
Oh,
where like, well, maybe not in every, does it happen in every single field? I know it happens in philosophy, for instance, where who are the greatest philosophers of our time? Everybody's going to tell you the pop psychology or the pop philosophers. And then same thing probably when it comes to psychology too. People are going to be way more attuned to pop psychology. But these are like the way that these things are written are oftentimes more engaging and more fun. And they might talk about cool things like the dark triad instead of boring things like, well, what's the subclinical evaluation of like blah blah blah. Like
yeah.
yeah. And it seems like I guess I'm a little harsh on that, but like yeah, it feels like sometimes academics need to do a much better job at making their stuff more presentable, or have like a wing of their institution that makes it more presentable, because otherwise you're always ceding all of that ground in popular culture to the people that are going to be the more entertaining figures that aren't as rigorous or studious when it comes to understanding the material itself. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a really big issue. It's something I actually like challenge like fellow academics with all the time, because
Hmm.
there's a lot of them where I'm like, you're so brilliant. Like, just come and talk about it and find like fun ways to explain it. And they're like, I just don't really want to do the social media rat race. And I'm like, that's super fair, but like if
Hmm.
nobody's calling these people out, and then when the minority who does call them out, academics basically like oftentimes will cowardly just like back down and be like, we don't really want to deal with this. So like, if there's like a researcher who kind of speaks out against certain things, and then pop psychology like absolutely vilifies them, goes on kind of a brigade to attack them.
Hmm.
Oftentimes schools would prefer to just be like, maybe just don't work here anymore. We don't really want to deal with it. They're like
Yeah.
true quintessential stability boomers, where they just in a lot of ways are just like, just don't disturb us. We'll leave you
Hmm.
alone so we can just kind of keep doing our science,
Hmm.
like go away basically, which I think is a really big problem, especially because it's like psychology is like the art of the human mind. It's what like
Yeah.
everyone is interested in it because it's about yourself.
Hmm.
And so it's the science that is the most difficult to do. It is the most rigorous process to do any good science with. You can barely make any like causal claims ever, and it is absolutely going to be misrepresented, and you need to be
Hmm.
on top of it.
And it's one of those things where I say the same with philosophy and psychology. You don't have to be an academic to practice either of these things because you're doing them constantly, right? Like we use psychology when we're having conversations with friends, when we're raising our children. Like literally every part of your life is going to involve interactions that fall under the domain of psychology or philosophy as well. And we decide
Yep.
like what is right or wrong. We make decisions on like should we do this? How do we, yeah. Yeah, and it's very frustrating sometimes because I know there was some frustration when the alt right was growing in 2016 and the race wheel stuff was getting a little bit more popular, not like super mainstream, but pretty popular. There's a lot of people, me included, that are kind of like looking to the academic world, and it's like, are you guys gonna like say or do anything? And I remember I would send out, because this is back when I was emailing professors, I would send out emails and stuff, and generally the response is just like, we don't really have those conversations. We don't really do that. We don't really like, we're not gonna come out and be like public debaters or have arguments over this. Like this is just not, and it's like, okay, well, what the fuck? Like, what the fuck is the purpose of what you're doing? If
Yeah.
you lose the battle culturally, it doesn't really matter what happens in the academic institution, because now policies are going to follow based on kind of like the cultural zeitgeist or the cultural feeling of a particular thing. And yeah, that unwillingness of an academic to kind of step into the mainstream, I think, is really frustrating sometimes because I think that voice is really needed and sorely lacking.
Yeah. And I think like that's something that I can always appreciate about Jordan Peterson, especially
Hmm.
within the field, is that he did step into it. He absolutely got put through the rigor, and he also got a lot of success out of it, right? He wasn't just a victim the entire time by any means.
Hmm.
But I can really appreciate like the bravery that it took. And a lot of people tried to be like, he's a terrible scientist. He doesn't know anything about like psychology science. And I'm like, that's just not true. Like he just does. Like he does
Hmm.
quite well. And you like can disagree with his political takes, that's fine, but like his knowledge on psychology is pretty solid. Like, and he's at least talking about it. Like, nobody else is even trying
Yeah.
to talk about it, right? He's at least willing to be like, hey, academics, like,
Mhm.
probably we should try to talk about this.
Mhm.
Which is,
Which
yeah,
is one of the
it's
reasons
great.
why I get even more frustrated with his political takes, because something that's very frustrating, and I'm sure you know this, is humans have a very binary understanding of other humans. You're either all good or all bad, and that's like the extent to which 99% of people can deal with somebody. And I constantly have to remind my audience of this, because like if I'm watching, somebody will link me like a Jordan Peterson video. We all hate Jordan Peterson, so it's very easy to get like a video, and he'll say something like, "Women are unhappier today than they were 40 years ago." It's like, he's lying. I know that he's a liar, conservative piece of shit. It's like, well, hold on. That's not necessarily true. That's not a lie, okay? This is like super well founded in the data. And it sucks because he made himself so political now that like every statement he says, but I won't just blame him actually, because I think people on the left in general are sometimes a little bit afraid to grapple with kind of harsh truths in reality. Like we have to be able to have a conversation about this, not because we agree with it or we want it to be the same, or we want to regress back to 50 years ago, but because like we have to be able to understand that a problem exists before we can even start to like, address it or solve it. Yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely. I think you're addressing of like the binary understanding is really important, and I think it's something that like again psychology like not that I think psychology is like a solve all for world problems. I hate it when like any field tries to pretend like they're like the only solution to everything.
Mhm.
But like this is where like really good mental health education is really important, right? Because what I'm seeing right now is there's this binary now happening with like psychological labels, right? Where somebody will be like, oh, well, they're a narcissist. They'll just like
Uh.
self-diagnose somebody as a narcissist. They
Mhm.
and what does that mean? Well, now that means you're a monster. Nothing you say matters. You're an abuser usually as well, and
Mhm.
fuck you.
Yeah.
That's all it means, right? And it's like
Mhm.
that that's not a very comprehensive understanding of what any mental health disorder is, right? We have to be,
Mhm.
especially because like just personality disorders in general right now are like really sexy,
Mhm.
and we have to be really careful because personality disorders are much more extreme mental health problems.
Mhm.
And I'm not sure like maybe you'd have a better understanding of like I honestly was like flabbergasted when I saw specifically like personality disorders blowing up as like labels in pop culture.
Mhm.
Like I just like didn't expect it at all, because like they're decently like rare. I was expecting things like anxiety and depression to blow up, which they like did, but it doesn't
Mhm.
feel like there's like nearly the like lacing of um,
Yeah.
villainy attached to them as like there are with like PD. So I'd be curious on your thoughts on that.
I read a really interesting paper a while ago. It's really boring. Fuck, somebody might have the link to it. But basically, in this paper, the author, I think it was a woman, she explores that basically mental illness used to be highly stigmatized in society, even in my lifetime. I'm 33. Even as a child, like highly stigmatized. People with depression were losers. Anxiety was something you're just supposed to get over, and God forbid if you're a man and you have these problems, you're basically a woman. You might as well be like, you're just worthless to society. Like in 90s, early 2000s, like men weren't allowed to have these types of emotional problems, even in my lifetime, and that's radically changed. But it seems like in the goal to be more tolerating of these conversations, the pendulum has swung a bit too far to where it's not so much now that we're just like tolerating these conversations, or not so much that we've destigmatized mental illness. Now we've made it like kind of sexy and like kind of cool, and you have this. I haven't sit. I need to like sit down to collect my thoughts on this, but like there's probably like a couple big things that play into why people are so big on these. One is probably being a victim is a lot of fun. You get a lot of like easy attention for it. It absolves you of a lot of bad actions. It gives it like you have a reason, why you are in the place you're in life. Like, well, it's my like. I talk to a lot of people. I don't know if you've seen this. People will frame sometimes daily decisions through their self-diagnosed mental illnesses. Like, I might be like, hey, like, did you finish this book or whatever? And they'll be like, oh no, I can't finish any book because of my ADHD or something. Let's say something like that. Like the
Yeah,
whole
yeah,
life
yeah.
is kind of yeah. Then so this, that's probably one big one, and then the second really big one is I think today, especially with social media, everybody really wants to be unique and everybody really wants to have like certain types of like cool reasons why they're like a unique and interesting person. And I mean, like the most common person on the internet is probably going to be like a cis white person, and damn, is that fucking boring. So if we're not gonna dip into gender identities or something else to like find some cool shit, then like sexy mental illnesses are now the way to do it. So you'll have people with these Twitter profiles, and for the life of me, I don't know why the fuck you would ever write a mental illness in your Twitter profile, but they'll have in their profiles now like autistic slash GAD slash depressed, blah blah blah. Like people are just like outwardly advertising it, and then everything related to that identity. It's not even used as like a source of like I have these issues, and so I'm identifying that so I can improve on them. It's more just like I have these issues so that I can kind of like tell jokes about them and like relate to other people about how like funny these things are, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to clarify, when I'm talking about like people overusing labels like narcissism and stuff, I started on TikTok. So when I'm talking about
Oh,
it, I'm
God.
actually I know.
I've heard the problems are like even more extreme
It
on
is.
TikTok because that's
It
where the
is.
DID shit came from. I don't know if we're
Yeah.
gonna do that or not, but yeah.
Yeah, we can get into DID. It's something actually that I differed on a couple of the professionals that you've talked to because it's a really contentious issue. But yeah, on I started on TikTok where I just part of why I started posting and stuff like that was because like narcissism was like the word on TikTok for a while, and I was like, just so it's clear, narcissism is super rare. Like we don't really have even good prevalence studies on it. Like depending on where you look for, prevalence ranges from 0.01% to 6%, right? 6% is almost at like GAD level, so I'm very dubious of the 6%.
Sure.
Clinically, as somebody who's worked in forensic settings, which if somebody's a narcissist, particularly if they're like a narcissist, somebody with actual narcissism who also has like impulse issues, you're going to expect to see them in forensic settings. That's where a lot of them end up, right? I truly...
Wait a second, real quick. When you use that word, when you say in forensic settings, does this mean settings related to like criminal justice or crime or?
Yeah, sorry. So when I
Okay.
say forensic psychology, it's talking about like jail. Sorry, I keep trying to say forensic settings. Yeah, jail, halfway houses, anything to
Gotcha,
do with
okay.
that kind of crime in the judicial system.
Okay, gotcha. Just make sure I understand. Okay.
Yeah,
Keep going.
thanks for clarifying that. And so it's really frustrating as somebody who's like, I've worked with a number of people. I've met a psychopath once. Like somebody who, I mean,
Is that this conversation or I'm just
it's
okay.
this one, yeah. No. And to be clear, psychopathy isn't diagnosable in the DSM, mostly because psychiatrists don't like any diagnosis that only has one measurement to assess it. But the problem is that the measurement made for it is like pretty much gold fucking standard. We still use it today, the PCLR.
Okay.
But it's not actually DSM recognized. They would only be diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, and they'd be considered severe, right? But just people like abusing words like psychopath and narcissism. It's like I've seen one psychopath. I've seen maybe one narcissist, but they weren't diagnosed, and I wasn't going to diagnose them. I'm not. I can't diagnose like at this point yet. Yeah, it was just. It's really frustrating to see like everyone talking about it because it's like, look, it's tricky because you don't want to like dismiss the suffering, right? Of being like, I totally believe that you've like gone through I believe that you were even potentially abused by an ex. Like, absolutely. It's not about discrediting that. It's just about saying, like, let's be careful about our language here, please. Because if you label somebody with a narcissist, to be honest, like, you kind of have written them off because you're labeling them with a personality disorder, which is what people write off people with personality disorders a lot.
And my understanding is that a personality disorder, generally, I think with borderline maybe being the only exception, personality disorders are generally considered like non-perceivable by the person that has them, right? Like it's not like an independent, like an external, it's like a cancer or a tumor. It's like kind of who they are, and I think that those are considered relatively like immovable. That like maybe you can kind of manage the parts of a personality disorder, but you're never going to become not a narcissist or something. I think is my understanding. Is that true or is that not true?
That is true. With the caveat of saying like borderline personality disorder is one personality disorder that I think is probably very unique in that I've definitely seen people with borderline personality disorder do a lot of trauma work, do a lot of DBT, and then by the end of their like treatment, even though once you're diagnosed with a personality disorder, it's considered a chronic condition, they're so much capable of managing it that you wouldn't even be able to tell, right? And they might still
Mhm.
like they might report like internal experiences of it.
Mhm.
Whereas like anybody who's like a narcissist, right? Again, they're very rarely diagnosed. There isn't a
Mhm.
self-evident form of treatment for them,
Mhm.
and so it's like you rarely see those people like move into what like you might call like I don't know, remission. Might be, it's not the right word, it's a much like too medicalized word. um,
Mhm.
I would say there's a lot of people again with BPD that are decently self-aware of it. There seems to be like a mixture. I've definitely worked with
Yeah.
BPD people who are highly self-aware of it,
Mhm.
and
This is what I think I said at the beginning. I was like, I think borderline is the only personality disorder I've heard that doesn't fall into that category of the personality disorders, where it's like the person doesn't generally perceive it. Usually, I think somebody with borderline, because of the conflicts they have with others and everything, usually can perceive that like something is very wrong with me. Whereas like
yeah.
people with narcissism or the other personality disorders who are like, this is just the way that I am. I don't think there's anything wrong with me. Like this is just who I am.
Yeah, I just
Mhm.
objectively am better than other people, like obviously,
Yeah,
right?
sure.
And that's a big thing people miss with narcissism is they're like, well, they're like assholes and they like take advantage of people. And I'm like, okay, but like the major trademark of somebody with narcissism personality disorder is the self-grandiosity that doesn't match them. So it's really hard to diagnose somebody who's maybe like super like I'm a Giga Chad and I'm a top dog, and then they are right. They're like one of the
Hmm.
top athletes in the world. It's really hard to call
Hmm.
that a narcissist. It sure is fucking annoying, right?
Hmm.
They're probably pompous. They definitely are like probably elitist, but it's hard to diagnose them as narcissists because again, the one client who I said there might have been some narcissism going on, they like had this strong almost delusional belief that they were going to be like an incredible famous rapper and they were the best at rapping, and then they would like perform, and it was like not great, right?
Hmm.
That's where we're seeing like actual true narcissism.
For
And
sure.
people are like, well, what about covert and overt and blah 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 blah? But it's like covert and overt aren't even like agreed on by the academics yet, so we need to be
Hmm.
careful before we like throw them out at people.
Sure.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I feel like we went on a weird side tangent, so I don't really. I can kind of try to go back to my prep. Um, oh, I don't want to just like jump around. Maybe going back to your statement about like the romanticization and like how you're saying like it's kind of sexy to have mental health problems. I think that that's a
Hmm.
really important actually conversation to be having,
Hmm.
because I've actually talked a fair bit, even just on TikTok, about like this my concern about the romanticization of mental health problems and how there's
Hmm.
actually going to be like motivation to claim a mental health problem when there's not. Particularly
Yeah.
like you said, like with the excusing of behavior, right? And like, oh well,
Yeah.
I have ADHD, so I just can't do these things, and it's like okay, there are absolutely like a deck of cards where certain things are going to be much more difficult for you to manage and you need
Hmm.
to like work through that. But to say that you just can't is decently unlikely. And my question would go, what supports can we give to you to make this more accessible to you? Right?
Yeah. The thing that I try not to blow up at people that say shit, but like anytime I hear anybody frame something through, especially a self-diagnosed mental illness, um, it's so incredibly frustrating to me. I get it just like the my understanding is that like not my understanding. I'll be more firm on this. The whole point of any diagnosis for anything ever is to give a treatment to something. Like we don't just diagnose things like, oh, you have this and now you're fucked. Good luck, right?
Yeah.
Like the goal is to be able to manage some ailment or manage a symptom or to make an accommodation so that somebody can live like a better life. When I see people self-diagnose with a certain mental illness and then they use that like, oh well, I can't do that because of this, or oh, it's just this is my thing keeping me, and oh blah blah blah, and it's like Jesus, like what the fuck? Like one, you don't even know if you have this, and then two, even if you do, it's not going to be like the limiting factor of like every behavior you could possibly have. Like it's so frustrating to hear somebody limit themselves that way, especially on something they might not even have. Yeah, that's a really irritating conversation to have.
Yeah, it's irritating because it's like, especially as somebody in the field, right? Like, there's this piece where it's like, I absolutely want to like maintain compassion for people, right? I don't want
Mm-hmm.
to be like an asshole and say that you're not suffering, right? The
Mm-hmm.
problem is that sometimes your suffering might not have a descriptive label that well applies to it. That doesn't mean
Mm-hmm.
that you're not suffering. It means that like, unfortunately, right now, like you're absolutely an individual who might be falling through the gaps a little bit, and so we can have conversations about what to do about people who are falling through the gaps, or we're like
Mm-hmm.
individuals who like have childhood trauma, and so no diagnosis perfectly fits for them, because childhood trauma just does very like diverse, but very like oftentimes pernicious things to people's like development and coping and attachment, right? So there isn't
Mm-hmm.
like a good label we can give it.
Mm-hmm.
but at the same time, not kind of encouraging people to like find their identity and being like, I'm just broken and that's the end of it, right? And it's just
Hmm.
like, there's a lot more that you can do always, and not just you, right? Because like I don't want to just be like, just like pull yourself up by the bootstraps, like it's all on you. But it's like there's also a
Hmm.
lot more supports that can be had if we can have accurate diagnosis. And I'm really glad that you talk about the purpose of a diagnosis, because it's like probably one of the, as I'm probably biased because I'm a psychometrician, so like diagnosis
Hmm.
is like the heart of things. But it is so important to understand that effective diagnosis of mental health is, this is one thing I really disagreed with some of the people you've talked to, where they said like diagnosis is easy, you can do it in like 6 weeks, anyone can do it. It is not easy at all. It takes a lot of time. You need to be really, really, really fucking careful,
Hmm.
because mental health is a soft science. The categories that we outline for different diagnoses shift and change every like
Hmm.
10 to 13 years. And the fact that the science itself is shifting and changing means that, of course, these things are somewhat ambiguous. And so,
Yeah.
like, just throwing labels on yourself or on others, or even like, yeah, it's just diagnosis is, it's so key because absolutely it informs treatment, right? The way you
Hmm.
treat somebody with anxiety and PTSD is decently different, right? The way you
Yeah.
treat somebody with depression versus anxiety is also very different.
Something that is really frustrating to me, that I brought up to one of the guys, or maybe two of the people I was talking to, is that like I feel like if I had a patient that came in and I could tell that they'd already read about a particular thing they think they have, I don't know if I would even want to work with that person
Mm,
because they'll already have like I've wondered if I either have ADHD or autism, and I don't even know if I would if I would trust myself to do a test, because I think I know the answers sometimes that I would need to give. Like when I see like the online tests are probably easier, but like you'll see a thing where it's like, like when you talk to a particular person, like do you feel like you are understanding them, or do you feel like you're doing well? And it's like, okay, well, if I'm autistic, I should answer this one or not, right? I feel like even for myself, I don't know if I would trust myself to take those tests. But when you get somebody that comes in and you're like, oh, do you think that you have like, or what's wrong with you? Tell me what's wrong. And the
right.
first thing they say is, well, I think that I have ADHD. I think that I have a lot of hyperfocus. I think that my oh God, what's the name for your executive function processor? Like when they start using language like this, it
Yeah.
feels like it's already game over. Like I couldn't imagine getting a patient that comes in thinking they have X whatever mental illness, and then you're like, the one thing would be to give them an alternative, which I think would probably still be good because at least they still have something to latch onto. But if you're like, no, I don't think you fit this at all, I feel like that patient is never coming back.
No.
They're just going to shop around for something else until they find somebody that like, this guy finally understands. I do have this thing, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, and it's really scary, and I don't know what to do about it, because I've actually watched people doctor shop to the point, because they're convinced that they have like something like BPD, and they go to
Hmm.
multiple psychologists and multiple doctors, and they're like, I don't think you do, and they just keep rotating until they found somebody who would validate that diagnosis. And this
Hmm.
individual absolutely did not present with the symptoms of it before, and now
Hmm.
they absolutely do, right? And it's like, well, what the fuck is that, right? Like,
Hmm.
what the fuck happened there? And that's really
Yeah.
concerning to me, of like, you don't want, like, psychology education shouldn't be causing people to actually be functioning worse within 2 years of getting like taught about like symptomology, right? Like that's really
Yeah.
scary. I mean, when it
Hmm.
comes to the autism thing, I would say like the ADOS, which is like this, it's actually how like you properly diagnose autism. I'm not even trained in it. Even in a psychometrician who did like an extra year of just training on tests, the
Hmm.
ADOS training is still like even beyond that. It's really extensive, and
Sure.
it's like a full day's worth of testing, and it's
Hmm.
really really rigorous. So like that would be something I'd be like, you probably could go actually get tested for that, and it would be like decently sound, because it's not like, it's not things you can always like cheat on, right? Because it's going to be doing like certain neurological testings as well.
I might be really, really rigorous, but I can be really, really autistic sometimes. So I don't know. But I no, I'm messing with you. I understand what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
but
the
ADHD, that's fair.
the what you're saying there too is also something that like I think I have experience with people will say something like, oh, like I had a collection of symptoms and I started reading and I realized that I have this particular thing. And then they'll even take that and go like, that's why I'm also going to stop trying to do this or this or this thing in life. Now I found out that there's even more things that I can't do well, or that I shouldn't even attempt to bother to try to do because I have this particular mental illness. Yeah, fuck. All of the conversations about it are actually so frustrating today.
Yeah.
It's weird because like you have like these. You brought up this phrase earlier, and I totally pushed back against it so much 5 years ago because people would go too far. I don't like to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, or like you are, you have to figure your own shit out. Like I think that's really toxic. but I definitely feel like we've gone too far in the other direction sometimes, where we've gone like somebody might say something like, here's a statement, okay? There are absolutely things that you can do to improve your mental health, even if you have clinical depression. Things like getting healthier food, exercising, like having social events. Like these are absolutely things that you can do to improve your outcomes. But if you even suggest that, people will say like, oh, what? I just pull myself up by my bootstraps? Is that what you want me to do? It's like, no, wait. Like you can't even have conversations about improving your outcomes anymore because people just assume that it's like you're telling somebody that they can fix their depression with a particular thing. It's like, well, no, that's not what's being said, you know?
Yeah, exactly, right? And it's this like again like I understand why the shift came because like mental health was not dealt with well in our society, right? There really was like a, oh, you're sad? Just don't be
Yeah,
sad, right? And it's like, well, that's not fucking helpful to anyone, obviously.
for sure.
But now there's this converse of being like, okay, usually what I tell my clients is I'm like, just so you know, like this race against like mental health and getting you like happy and well and like functioning is really important. And I will put in as much effort as you put in, but I can't
Hmm.
drag you across the finish line because it won't matter to, like it won't
Hmm.
be meaningful, right? So if you're putting in a ton of effort, I'm going to put in a ton of effort. But like especially I have to say this because I work also with like addiction clients, right, which can be like really really draining
Hmm.
on the because as a worker you can always do 30 times more than your client, particularly in the addiction field. um, but I think it's really really important to remember like just because people want to come around and support you and that's good, it doesn't mean that you should kind of like lay back and like expect people to carry you through. There's
Hmm.
absolutely things that you can do, and I'm not going to sit here and be like, oh, well, if you're depressed, just like eat better and you'll be
Hmm.
fine. Like it's obviously not that simple, but why wouldn't you be trying it, you know?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really really important um, thing to bring up, and I'm glad that at least on like Twitch and in this social media space you're kind of like making space for that conversation to happen, because I think even like a year ago, um, like as somebody in the field, it's intimidating to even try to talk about it because the backlash against you is like so hard, and they're just like, you're
Yeah,
just
I
like a
still
victim
definitely
blamer and you're
have.
still like a terrible person, and it's just like
Yeah. And that victim, not victim, but that like victim blaming complex, like it carries over into like every part of society where to have any type of conversation, you have to like caveat, like even in this conversation with you, you've heard me like, I'm going to caveat this, I'm going to say that or whatever, because people get so mad. I remember that like so like two other quick examples I can think of. When I was really poor, there were two big costs you can control in your life. One is your rent and one is your car payment. These are like
Mhm.
the two biggest payments that any working class person has to deal with.
Yeah.
And oftentimes, like if you were having issues like affording rent, like the one of the biggest things you could do is like try to find a cheaper apartment. And I think that we were having a conversation about this. It was like, yeah, sometimes moving can be like the best way to, it's the biggest expense you have. And that whole conversation topic got boiled down to like, Destiny thinks poor people should just move and that'll fix their problems. Just move, just move. It's like, well, no, that's not true, right? That's an oversimplification of what I said. But even just like saying that would like make people like so upset in terms of like suggesting that you have some level of autonomy over yourself, like is so upsetting to people.
Yeah.
There was the Just Move thing, and there was there was another example having to do with like dating, I think, and somebody made a post about like should a woman, if you go over to a guy's house after a date, like is it okay for the guy to expect sex or something?
Right.
And I think that largely the answer is you should never expect sex. It's not, you should never pressure somebody like that. But I
Right.
think the thing that I said was like, if you're willing to invite somebody over to your home, it was from the woman's side. If you're willing to invite somebody over to your home, then like sex is something that you should like be ready for, because that's going to be the expectation, whether it's like you have it or not. Like that's going to be what people are thinking of. And oh man, the amount of anger from that take too was also like, are you saying it's okay to rape women that invite you to their house? Like Jesus Christ, no, that's
Yeah.
not what I'm saying. But
Yeah.
yeah, and then and then all the mental stuff carries the exact same types of conversations. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's just like it's I don't know if it's worse on TikTok. I feel like TikTok and Twitter are kind of the same, but like yeah, I talk a fair bit on my TikTok about like dating, because I'm really really passionate about assertiveness training for women,
Hmm.
because I think it's
Oh, like
really
Jordan Peterson.
I guess it is Jordan Peterson. I guess he does talk about assertiveness training.
Because he works with women a lot. And he says one of the biggest issues with women is they're not assertive enough in the workplace when it comes to things like asking for raises and stuff. And that's a big issue why some of the pay gap might exist for sexism reasons. Yeah.
Yeah, which like I wouldn't say like is women not being assertive an issue. I would say
Hmm.
no, unless they have certain goals that they want to achieve. Then yeah,
Hmm.
you probably do need to. But assertiveness training more for me is about consent and sexuality. That's actually more
Hmm.
what I'm focused on. But that might just be like my bias because again, I just don't care that much about like climbing the ladder and like the financial rat race. Like it's not something I'm super passionate about.
Hmm.
And so I'm like, yeah, like if a woman wants to like do better in like a business setting, yeah, she probably should learn how to like negotiate wages and stuff a little bit better. Particularly because like I would disagree with Jordan Peterson. I think there are definitely like spaces in the workplace that are absolutely like more biased towards women. I think like
Hmm.
women, um, either you're gonna glean a lot of respect as a woman like pretty quickly,
Hmm.
or if you kind of like misspeak or you like look a little bit more like passive, you're gonna get much more quickly kind of like
Hmm.
thrown to the side and then ignored and not really respected
Sure.
for your opinion, right? I think that that like kind of more implicit bias still exists within the workplace, which is why
Sure.
absolutely women, especially if they've been in that position where they're more agreeable, they're not as likely to speak up for themselves, they can absolutely benefit from learning how to speak up for themselves. And the reality is their life quality will probably somewhat improve because they'll get
Hmm.
more of the things that they want and need. Um,
Hmm.
but for sexuality specifically, I think it's actually really, really important to like normalize women approaching men. I think is like a really big thing that I'm passionate about, because then you can set the terms of the negotiation and you can make it
Hmm.
safer for yourself as a woman, right? Because I think like
For sure.
there's absolutely like concerns about like domestic violence and even just like sexual assault and stuff like that. Like there's very legitimate safety concerns that women have,
Hmm.
and if we normalize women approaching more often, they have a better space to like they can choose where they're approaching men. So rather than being approached in like a dark at night while they're like waiting at a bus stop and they don't really have anywhere to go because they can't miss their bus, they can
Hmm.
choose to approach somebody in a grocery store, right, and have a better interaction there. That doesn't
Hmm.
obviously help them in the bus stop situation, but if
Hmm.
cultural norms shift a little bit, we might start seeing less of that behavior,
For sure.
because men are going to get more used to being approached by women, right? But a
Hmm.
lot of women are too uncomfortable. They're nervous about rejections. They think people are going to think they're weird, which is something I think actually just like basic assertiveness training could really help with.
Yeah, for sure.
Same with like consent, right? Like if you're a woman, you want to bring a guy back to your house, but you don't want to have sex, like just say that, right? Just figure
Hmm.
out like how I kind of call it like palatable assertiveness because there's a lot of like woman empowerment stuff that like basically encourages women
Hmm.
to just be like super mean.
Yeah.
And it's just like, okay, but you have to realize, right? Like if you're in a situation where you're worried about your safety, being
Hmm.
super mean in that situation is not likely to keep you
Produce a good
safer. It's
outcome.
going
Yeah.
to potentially escalate things and make it more dangerous for you. And this isn't about
Hmm.
like worrying about the other person's feelings necessarily, which I don't think is nothing, right? Like it would be nice if like we could reject men more nicely sometimes.
Hmm.
But it's really fundamentally in large part about the safety of women of saying like, hey, how do we palatably be assertive? How do you palatably say like, hey, no, I'm just not interested, but not be super like terrible about it, right? Like
Yeah.
that's
This is
kind of what I talk about when I'm saying assertiveness training, just
mhm.
because it's actually a really really broad field of therapy.
For sure. One thing that is a little bit irritating sometimes is that like there are definitely a lot of negative social things that exist regarding women. That was an incredibly vague statement. But it's frustrating because like almost every negative like socio like gender dynamic that exists, it's usually reinforced by both sides. But
Yeah.
having that conversation is very, very, very hard, because it almost always immediately comes across as being like victim blamey or something like that. And then people get like very upset about like suggesting that like, well, maybe the standard can change on the other side as well. You know, like um, maybe it's not just men that need to change. Maybe women can also change in some way too to alleviate this. But like
Yeah.
that conversation is very hard to have. So
So
one thing I talk
right.
about in terms of like men having like a lot of kind of like rapey behavior and that being really normalized,
Yeah.
that's a problem and it shouldn't happen and it's really horrible. But if you have a society where men are constantly expected to make the first move, and sometimes women are even expected to say no more than they'd like to, I mean, what do you expect? But besides creating a society where men are, maybe more likely to push too far sometimes, like that's just going to happen, of course,
Yeah.
as they try to figure out like where the boundary is, right? So that's like a gender norm that could be fixed on with pushing on both sides, you know.
Yeah, even like I was watching Yellowstone last night, and there's this idea that a lot of like some of my followers have brought up that like I'm not super exposed to, but like I've always been a pretty like decently disagreeable, like straight shooting woman. And so they talk about this idea of like a lot of women say like the reason why I didn't date you or didn't say yes to you is because you didn't try hard enough. Like you should have pursued me harder, right?
Hmm.
Which is really it's a really bad idea. I get it from like the romantic end. Like I don't want to totally destroy romanticism and like say like there's no
Hmm.
space for like kind of that tension and excitement.
For sure.
But in a culture where like so much sexual assault is being brought out, there's lots of concerns around like consent and like safety in these engagements, in large part because of our like sexual emancipation in the 60s. Like the terms of sexual engagement between the sexes really changed, right? And
Hmm.
women now have birth control. And so like as the landscape has changed, obviously our social norms have to change. And I would totally agree, we're kind of like in this midway where like there's certain traditional values that are still kind of occupied by both sexes and
Hmm.
genders. And then there's also these really like modern values that we're occupying. But sometimes these are mutually exclusive ideas, right?
Yeah.
And so like even yesterday I saw in like Yellowstone like this woman being like, well, are you gonna like kiss me? And like he was like,
Hmm.
oh, like I think she didn't even say, well, are you gonna kiss me? She turns like she's like, well, you're in a bad situation. Hey, if you kiss me right now and I don't want it, you're being predatory. But if I want it and you don't kiss me, like basically like you're kind of being like, I think the implication was
Squandering an
like,
opportunity.
yeah, you're kind of being like, but I think more than that, not just squandering opportunity, but like kind of being like a weak male, right?
Oh, sure. You're not fulfilling your role as like a masculine figure. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Like you're not pursuing me hard enough. And it's just like,
Yeah.
hey,
Another really big example of this dynamic in society is that women are being empowered more and more to pursue higher education, which
yeah,
they're now exceeding men by a scary amount. By what I
yes.
would say is probably a not good amount now. In the United States, I think it's 60% of newly graduating people are women, which that's a scary tip. But women still, the last survey stuff that I saw, women still are generally not as willing to date down socioeconomically. So while women have taken on more roles that were traditionally masculine, so working certain jobs and earning a lot of money, being the breadwinners, men aren't allowed to step into what were traditionally more feminine roles,
Yeah.
like being a home or caretaker, because that's like a loser position that a man shouldn't work, you know?
Hmm.
So it's interesting that, like, yeah, that balancing that dynamic out is very difficult.
It's so difficult, right? And the problem is that nobody's very good at saying what they actually want, right? There's a lot of
Hmm.
women who will say, well, I want like a really highly vulnerable man. And then there's so many men who are like, yeah, I get really vulnerable and sensitive and I like tell them what I'm insecure about. And then she like immediately becomes like pretty unattracted to me, right? And I'm just like,
Uh-huh.
okay, first of all, I don't have that experience. I've never done that myself. So I'm like, I don't know if this is broadly true or if this is just people who are like bitter saying that this is true, right? Like obviously like as you as a man who's dated women can probably report better about that experience, but it's like that if that's true, then that means that women are saying that they want highly vulnerable men, but they don't entirely. They want men who will be
Hmm.
emotionally supportive to them, but they don't necessarily want to support them. And I don't think that that's all or most women.
Hmm.
I guess I'd be curious on your thoughts on that as somebody who's just dated women. Do
I
you?
think that it's another difficult thing where, and I say this sometimes and it sounds really mean. Well, no, this applies to men and women. It's very hard to pull somebody and get an honest thing of like what they might want for like dating related stuff. That can be very misrepresented sometimes, I think, right? Where I did not mean to do that. Where like if you were to pull, this is just a guess, okay? I'll do this for both sides. If you were to poll men and say, is a woman being quite a bit younger than you a massive plus without outweigh a lot of other things? I think that the true answer to that is going to be much higher than what men might put on a poll.
Yeah.
Like, well, nah, is a woman age that important? Like, nah, I don't think so, right? But then like a 22-year-old comes along and is like, oh, is she, is she negative in like every other area of my life? Sure, right? Or then same thing on the flip side for women. Like, is a man being incredibly wealthy, is that really that important? Women like, no, of course not. I would never go after a man just because he's wealthy. But then like in the real life, like, like I think that it's hard to pull around issues like that. I think it gets very complicated very quickly because how people act in real life might not coincide with how they would like idealistically answer a poll about their own behavior or desires. And then even when it comes time for certain things, like I want a man that's more, to your example, like emotionally vulnerable.
Yeah.
Do they really mean that, or is that like a thing where they say they want somebody that's emotionally vulnerable, but what they really want is somebody that like will only cry when like their whole family dies, and then otherwise they're just like a very supportive person, and maybe they have the capacity for it. Like, do you really want this sounds very, I'm not trying to sound sexist, but like, do you really want a man that is willing to cry as much as like a woman might have traditionally? Like, I think a lot of women would probably be turned off by that in certain situations, even if they say otherwise. So it's a hard thing to navigate. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And it's something, honestly, like in my own relationship with my partner, I've had to navigate. And, you know, I always hate saying this because everyone is going to call me a pick me immediately, which is absolutely not what I am. But there's definitely an issue that I've struggled with in my relationship where, like, I am definitely, I identify as a woman and all these things, but I occupy a lot of more like traditionally masculine personality traits. Now, I very much apply to more of like a gender. I don't love the rigidity of gender roles or anything like that, which is why
Hmm.
um I'm just giving the caveats, I guess.
Sure.
But my husband identifies as a man, but he occupies again a number of more feminine personality traits. And I realized that I was doing this thing that I think a lot of women do, where when he like emotionally needed certain supports,
Hmm.
I was willing to give it. But if I also felt emotional, so say he brought something to me that upset me and he was feeling really hurt, but what he brought to me hurt my feelings, I think I had this implicit kind of bias of being like, well, my feelings are always going to be number one priority because they're like bigger. I think and I've talked with a lot of women who are like, actually, I think that that's kind of true, and it's definitely not like an explicit thing, right? It's a very
Hmm.
much like an implicit bias of being like, I get that you're hurt, but like I'm hurting right now, and there's kind of
Hmm.
like that implicit like, and I'm the woman in the relationship,
The
right?
woman.
So
Yeah.
like my feelings, can't we get to my feelings first? And he's like, what do you mean? Like I brought my feelings up first. Like why would we get to
Hmm.
your feelings first, right?
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
as we were working through a relationship, it was a really big area that I really hurt him in, and so I had to actually work hard on like challenging myself. And literally what I would do is I'd be like, he would say something to me that maybe like upset me, and then I'd be like, wait, if this was like your best friend who is another woman, how would you feel about it? And I'm like, oh, I could
Hmm.
totally make space for her feelings first and then also voice my feelings after. Like it wouldn't
Hmm.
even be a question to me. And I was like, okay, if that's the case, you obviously have an implicit bias here and you need to like make space for his feelings. There's no reason not to, in large part because what I want in my relationship is a much more egalitarian relationship, right?
Hmm.
And I think there's just not, I don't think there's like a social consciousness of this like um, dynamic happening. And
Hmm.
so there's again, you have these things where people are saying what they want. I want an emotionally vulnerable man, but they're not actually saying what they actually want, which is I want you to be emotionally supportive to me. I don't really want you to cry as much as like I do though. Like I don't
Yeah.
really want that, right? Because
That
it
sounds
sounds
really bad to
terrible.
say though, but
Yeah.
yeah. I think that something that I have a talk with somebody else right after our talk actually, and we talked about this last time, so it's funny that you bring this up. Something that I think people run into that is an issue is when we talk about like deconstructing kind of these like roles that exist in society, like why do men act the way they do? Why do women act the way they do? Can we take away these things? I think that there's a lot of value in kind of deconstructing those, but I think that it's very important to understand why they existed in the first place. So when people like to act like, oh, men and women are totally interchangeable, nothing matters, there's no difference between the two or whatever, it's like, okay, I understand the desire for that, but like there's probably a reason why some things have existed. And it might be the case that in some reasons, the reason why was just because people were assholes and they were losers and there's no good reason for it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But it might also be the case that they existed for, maybe like a much better reason. Maybe there was like a real reason why these things, maybe women do tend a certain way or men do tend a certain way. Like that's totally possible, that's believable.
Yeah, I think there. It reminds me of this quote, which is basically like question tradition but distrust the obvious, right? And so it's
Sure.
like you absolutely, as like Nietzsche would even agree on, like you absolutely should look at all of the assumptions that our culture have made, traditional gender roles, all these things, and you should
Hmm.
absolutely question them and be like, is there validity here? And like kind of deconstruct it and be like, what have these roles offered? Okay, well, a lot of part of these roles absolutely relied on the fact that like women had no way to control whether or not they got pregnant with sex, right? Which is
Hmm.
part of why monogamous marriage became such an important thing in our culture because it actually protected women a little bit more,
Hmm.
right? And like that's why that happened. But now in our culture, that principle basically isn't at play. So how do our relationships need to change to accommodate a new like factual landscape that we exist on, basically, right?
Yeah. Hmm.
And so I think it's a really important thing that basically you're like bringing up here, being like, what are we inheriting that is valuable? What was the purpose to it? And like before we just like do away with all traditional like values and all these things, um, let's try to analyze what their worth is. And if there isn't any worth, that's fine,
Then
right?
toss it. Yeah.
We can toss
Hmm.
it, but you don't want to toss babies out with the bathwater. And I think that's what we
Yeah,
tend to do
exactly.
in the name of progress. Is we're like, well, there's a lot of really harmful things that came with really traditional gender roles. Absolutely,
Hmm.
like domestic violence was a massive issue, right? The fact that like there was like the Hydes Law in the UK until like 1993, where like it wasn't technically rape if a man like raped his wife, right? Like
Yeah, because you can't rape your wife,
obviously
right?
those are
Hmm.
fucking terrible things, right? And I'm
Yeah.
glad that we've done away with them. But, you know, there's a lot of women that I've talked to that are older that they've kind of been sold this idea by like modernity that like a woman should really want career first and then maybe later she'll get a husband. And it's like, okay, well, first of all, you've dramatically limited the pool because, as you said, most women tend, I find, not to want to date down educationally. They
Hmm.
often want men similar educated, but as you said, 60% of people getting degrees are women. So you
Hmm.
have already a smaller pool of men to select from, right? A lot of women are like pursuing all these things. They're having struggles potentially with fertility issues because they're getting pregnant a lot later and well, getting married and then getting pregnant a lot later. And
Hmm.
so I've run into a lot of like women in their like 30s to 40s who are like, man, I feel like I was fed a fucking lie. Where like I've got like 6 degrees on my wall,
Hmm.
and now I'm 40 and I'm like, fuck, I just want a family. And I'm like,
Hmm.
that's okay too. Like people can actually want very traditional, simple things like a family.
Hmm.
Like there's nothing wrong with just wanting to be. I know lots of women who are like, I actually kind of just want to be a stay-at-home mom. And I'm like, well, with inflation, it's unlikely, but like, you know, that's a fair thing to want to have. And it feels like we've kind of tossed the baby out the bathwater and like not made space. Like I wish as we were doing this like gender role reduction, which I'm actually broadly in favor for,
Hmm.
because it benefits somebody like me, right?
Yeah.
I worry about us actually. What we've done is we've almost just made new rigid boxes instead.
Yeah. And that, like, I think that, like, it was supposed to be the way that it always presented to me, the way that I always argued at others is that, like, when we talk about eliminating gender roles, the point wasn't to make it so that you were shamed for doing traditional stuff. It was that you had an option not to. Like, that's
Yeah,
all it meant.
yeah,
If you didn't want to be like a stay-at-home mom, that's fine. You don't have to be. You're not going to be forced to. But if you make it so that now people are like shamed for being stay-at-home moms, like, okay, well, now we've just kind of like moved in the opposite direction, you know?
yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Hmm.
But I don't think you and I are going to disagree on like I've
Probably on
watched.
any of these things,
Yeah,
yeah.
I think fundamentally like here's the problem with you, Destiny, is you're just so damn consistent. It's hard to disagree with you on many things, right? So,
True. Absolutely true.
which is actually like refreshing, but probably also not something that I should like expect in all spaces. Is there anything on like dating or psychology that you think would be interesting to talk about or bring up?
I don't know. This is not to. I'm not trying to drag myself up, but like I guess the boring thing is that like I like to have conversations with more educated people. But most of the opinions I think that I have, I like to at least I like to assume that like I'm usually like, well, what does the research say about this thing, or what do like educated people say? So there's not usually much like area for disagreement. So usually we come on and then we kind of circle jerk, and then I go back into the sludge that is online conversation. um, uh, I guess usually something that I'll ask is like, have you heard me say something? I guess you disagree with me a lot about, and then we can move from there. I guess. Do you feel like when I've mentioned anything related to psychology or any of these topics that I've been like super off or wrong about a particular thing, or
DID. That's one that I think we might differ on because I think you're
okay?
pretty. I'm not sure. I guess what is your view on DID? And just to clarify for viewers who don't know, that means dissociative identity disorder, or people who feel like they have multiple personalities that they switch between.
Um, the way that it's described, I think is total bullshit. There might be like a world where I think the last person I talked to tried to say this. So like there might be a world where like I understand what people say. Or hold on. Somebody was trying to describe DID before as like a we can have trauma in our childhood that makes us act in different ways in different situations. Like when you get rid of like the really sexy interpretation of like the multiple personalities, that I can see maybe there's something called DID. But in terms of like how it's often talked about or portrayed, I think it's just total horseshit.
Yeah, I mean it's definitely become just like sexy and cool.
Mhm.
Um, I would be so there's a really big split in academic psychology about DID. There's
Hmm.
absolutely people who are like, there is no question that there are rare individuals with these multiple personalities that they actually do like switch between and have different consciousnesses like operating at different times. And then there's other people who'd be like, absolutely not, this is horseshit. This is just like an extreme form of things that we all do, which is like, of course, you're going to be a little bit different with like your
Yeah.
grandma or when you go to work, right? And
Hmm.
so there's kind of people being like, there's kind of these two camps. Unlike I think a lot, I'm actually, this is probably one area where I'm like much more like radical in, which is compared to like I have a lot of like OG psychological takes. But DID is something I'm actually very in favor of broadly, not the way it's portrayed on social media because it's just like really glamorized. I think there's absolutely a lot of people who like benefit from faking it and it's really destructive. The problem is that like people don't realize like when you fake it and like claim these things and you don't have it, you absolutely destroy the legitimate suffering and like experience of people who actually are suffering with this on a day to day, right? It's the problem why when
Hmm.
you're like people are like, oh, I'm just being like so ADHD, and I'm like, okay, but like, or like ADHD is like my superpower, and I'm like, I'm glad that it is for you, but for most people who experience it, it's really really frustrating. So like,
Hmm.
let's be careful about how we're characterizing this and not like dismissing the legitimacy. I can
Yeah.
send you some articles that I would say to me are what strongly convinced me. So I will admit I'm probably biased towards DID because my undergrad supervisor that I did my undergrad thesis under, he was actually like a pretty central DID researcher in Canada before he switched into research peer. He
Hmm.
worked at like our like basically our mental hospitals, like severe mental hospitals. For 30 plus years before he moved into research. And what moved him into research was DID because he did have a client with DID.
Hmm.
Um, so it's super, super rare, like super, super rare, um, because it requires, what we do believe is it requires immense amounts of trauma
Hmm.
and probably something else. But really, it's rare enough that most of the research we have it is actually case studies because we don't even have a
Yeah.
big enough population of them to do like quantitative analysis on. So you can't like
Hmm.
talk about their genetics or like is there this biological influence because you just have these individuals,
Hmm.
which is why when I see like so many people on social media having it, I'm very dubious, right? As soon as the prevalence on social media doesn't really seem to match, I'm like, it's possible that the reason why they're blowing up on social media is because it's so sensational, so maybe it does match. It's like kind of that selection bias of
Selection
like
by, yeah.
what bleeds leads, right?
Hmm.
So it might just be that. But I'll send, I'll maybe post some articles in your because I think, is your Discord still messed up? I'll just post it in your chat.
Yeah. Even if the Discord is messed up, it'll probably work after a while. Test. No, it's working now. Should be good.
Okay, I'll send it there. I'll post it there, and I'll also send it to you on Discord then, so
Hmm.
you have it on hand whenever you'd like to look at it on your own. Oh, my Discord's now broken on my computer, so I won't send it there. Sorry. So this one is really, the first one I send is a really interesting article. So it's basically they would argue it is documented objective evidence of DID. So it was in a number of individuals who were incarcerated, and
Uh-huh.
so the beauty of studying incarcerated individuals, which I like want a caveat of being like, obviously it's not beautiful, they're incarcerated, blah blah blah. Anyways, is that you get so much data on them, right? The tricky thing with like any form of therapy is that you are only at the mercy of what your client wants to tell you, right? So you
Yeah.
can have a
So they might
client.
have other things in their life that are fucking with them. Their diet might get super fucked. Their sleep might get super fucked. They might have adverse events, stressful. Yeah, but in a prison environment, a lot of that is more control. It's as close as you can get to that person in a vat study as you possibly can get. Yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of people lie about the bad things that they do, right? So like,
Hmm.
I was working with a client for a super long time who was like, I just don't understand why my kids don't want to be in relationship with me. And it literally took me working with this client for 8 months before I found out, oh, she really aggressively physically abused her children for a long
Sure.
time, right? And
Yeah.
it's like, how did this not come up sooner, right? Like,
Hmm.
like it's not, and I understand why, right? It's a shame, but it's like as a this is why I actually almost never really like to do one-on-one counseling. I'm very pro group therapy because
Hmm.
that shit comes out real quick in group therapy. Like their weird social dynamics, or they're like everyone's just really mean to me, and then you like watch them in group therapy, and they're just like actually like really condescending to everyone they talk
Hmm.
to, and I'm like, well, yeah, people are being mean to you, but like you're instigating it a lot of time. Like you're treating people like they're stupid.
Hmm.
Anyways, that's a side tangent. I'm just very pro group therapy, and a lot of people I've noticed never talk about group therapy. But it's actually, I would argue, like better in almost all circumstances, excluding again like severe cases like DID. I wouldn't put an individual with DID in group therapy for
Sure.
obvious reasons. I think it's kind of group
Hmm.
therapy with a DID person, I guess, in some to some extent.
Yeah,
So
easiest way to double the size of your group, right?
yeah,
Honestly. But
yeah,
okay.
my sample size, yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
so in this article that I sent you, 11 out of the 12 individuals had documented cases of extreme childhood abuse. And now, when a social worker lists something as extreme childhood abuse, we're talking probably intentionally malicious, maybe even torturous levels of childhood abuse. Like really, really, really terrible shit, right?
Hmm.
Um, and most of these, no, actually, all of the individuals that had this reported childhood abuse also had amnesic experiences of abuse. So the abuse was documented, it was verified, they had photos of the injuries, the social worker, like basically, like the government came in and was like, absolutely, there's abuse going on here. And most of the
Hmm.
individuals didn't remember it, which
Hmm.
actually happens a lot more often than people realize. And I hate to popularize that because amnesic experiences with abuse now it just gets like abused as well.
Sure.
Um,
So I'll drill down into this because
sure.
I don't believe this is real. So
Okay.
maybe you can convince me, right?
Okay.
So I think that there are two ways that something isn't properly codified into long-term memory and can be accessed. One is if an injury is present, especially like a head injury, obviously. And then the second would be if a drug is present that inhibits that function for some reason. Um, Sans those two things, if neither of those conditions are met, and we're talking about like a repressed memory, I feel like you can have a repressed memory where like something is maybe painful or cringy or irritating, and so you intentionally like don't think about it, and you just like I'm just not gonna think about it, and then maybe over a long period of time you genuinely do forget about it. I would believe that as being a phenomenon, but the idea that like you can have an adverse like event and then you just like you don't remember that at all because it was so traumatic seems to be exactly contrary to everything that we understand about traumatic events, that these are usually codified like in the most extreme manner to memory, that you can have like triggers related to things that are even remotely resembling any of that sensory data, any of that stimulus, like people with like triggers, like actual triggers like PTSD and stuff. Why yeah, can you do you yeah break that apart for me? That's where I like my mind is at, I guess,
Yeah.
in terms of like repressed memories and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a really valid critique, and that's why I'm glad you bring it up, because it allows me to flesh this out. Because
Hmm.
absolutely, amnesic experiences of abuse definitely get over used. People overclaim it. There are absolutely cases of individuals creating false memories. Based on this, so that can absolutely happen. I guess the main thing I would point out, I don't have it on my like list because I didn't expect us to go in this direction necessarily, but I read a paper like 2 weeks ago about this that was showing that in cases of children, so part of you have to understand, it seems to be the case that trauma seems to do two things to memory. It either heightens it or it diminishes it, depending on basically probably a lot of things, probably in part personality, probably in
Hmm.
part your age, likely in part like the problem with trauma is it's so complex and we have such like low resolution conversations about trauma where we're just like all trauma is the same because don't want to invalidate people's experiences, but it's like obviously
Hmm.
not all traumas are the same because there's a really big difference between like getting in a car crash, waking up and seeing like your decapitated parent or something like that versus like just getting in a car crash. Like those are obviously different experiences. It doesn't mean that
Hmm.
your experience with the car crash wasn't terrible, especially
Sure.
for your lived experience is probably the worst thing that's maybe ever happened to you.
Hmm. And even
But
the resiliency of an individual might interpret how negative a trauma can like affect a person too. A highly resilient person, maybe not as much, or other.
totally,
Yeah, there's yeah, it's
totally.
complicated, very complicated.
Yeah, we know that people's tendency for sensitivity for stimulation varies, right? There are some people that actually are just more sensitive to stimulation. They tend often
Yeah.
to be more introverts, where they get overstimulated. We can actually test this pretty young from babies, and it's decently predictive, even just with baby tests of like you just expose them to kind of a novel stimuli, and if they smile and engage, it is pretty predictive of how they're going to respond later in life, to being extroverted versus introverted, but it's also
Hmm.
decent. Again, decent as in I'm saying like probably like a point 0.3 for people who are like into like probabilities and stats, right? Probably like a point 0.3 of predicting whether or not they'll also like respond better or worse to more distressing environments, whether those distressing things are going to cause them to develop a mental health problem or not, right?
Hmm.
Um, so
Wait, can
there's
I ask one question related to that? This is,
sure.
I hope this doesn't sound right. Is it known that there are ways, reliable ways to develop resiliency in children?
Yes, there are ways to develop resiliency. Are you wanting me to go through them as well?
Yeah, like what are like the top one or two? Is it just gonna be like having a secure, loving relationship with a
Yeah,
parent,
I'm gonna
or
be. They're disappointing because
uh,
it's one of these things of like sometimes when people are like, what's this mental health trick, and I'm like, you probably already know it, right?
hmm.
Having a really solid social thing, but a really big one that I think a lot of people who are parenting right now don't know about is it's really important to give your children what we call like manageable stress. So if you say your little toddler is building like a tower and you're watching it and you know the next block they're going to put on is going to fucking topple that shit. You know
Hmm.
it. And you step in and you fix it so it doesn't topple. And I would argue to some extent you're actually protecting them from a healthy, manageable stress that they could overcome. Right? It's gonna topple. They're gonna get upset. They're gonna cry, and then be like, "Hey, buddy, it's okay. Let's
Hmm.
rebuild it. Like, maybe let's not put our block there." It's in an instructing moment. Like, how do you actually overcome this stressor? So that is probably one main thing that any parent can do that absolutely is going to teach, because what it cultivates is something actually that I'm passionate about because I've done my thesis was on this, which is called growth mindsets, which I would say growth mindsets is probably one of the most fundamental like non-conscious system that's probably contributing to like resilience and grit and all these kind of terms, which is
Hmm.
basically if you come across a problem, do you believe I'm stuck as I am, there's nothing I can do to improve, so I may as well like roll over and die to this problem? Or do you think, hey, this trait that I have, whatever it is, my ability to build towers, is probably changeable. I can probably improve it over time. So, how do I do that? Right?
Hmm.
So, I'm really passionate about growth mindsets because I think it's fundamental and it's not super hard to cultivate. My research was on social anxiety and just convincing some students that were kind of self identified as like highly shy and anxious around like social settings to just basically believe that they could change their social anxiety. Because a lot of people actually who have like mental health problems get very fixed, where they're like, I'm depressed and there's not much I can do about it. I am an anxious person and there's not much I can do about it. Like, that's my baseline. And it's like, actually, those things are pretty changeable. You can
Hmm.
absolutely improve them. So, regarding resilience, I would say the best thing you can do in your kid is cultivate a growth mindset and allow them to experience manageable stressors, right? If they lose a
Hmm.
race, it's fine. You should be happy that they lost the race because they're going to be bummed, but it's
Hmm.
good for them because that's a manageable stress, right? Things like chronic aggressive bullying, I wouldn't say is like manageable stress for a lot of kids. Those are situations where I'm like,
Gotcha.
yeah, you probably should move your kid away from that school because sometimes bullying just clears up by just giving them a new social setting, and then suddenly they're like a big fish in that school. But yeah, you definitely want them to like undergo certain stressors, allow them to fail, and then
Hmm.
your job as the parent is to come in alongside and say, how do we approach this again and overcome it this time? How can we problem solve, right? That's really good for resilience.
Okay, gotcha. I had a friend a while ago that recommended a book that I never read because I'm too lazy, but it was interesting, and it kind of goes along with this. Conventionally, we're kind of taught that stress is like really negative, like physiologically, it has a lot of negative effects on the body. And I think that this book went on to make the argument that there's two types of stress, basically. Stress where we feel hopeless is horrible for us, it's
Mm-hmm.
incredibly bad physiologically. But stress that we feel like we can manage is can be a good experience. Um, yeah, and that was interesting because like I've had a lot of stress in my life for a lot of different reasons,
Mm-hmm.
and but I always feel like I have a lot of agency, and I like those environments where they're very stressful. It makes me feel really good, and I've always wondered sometimes like, am I gonna have a lot of negative like is the cortisol destroying my heart or something? And like I don't my mental seems to be pretty high,
Yeah.
and then understanding that concept kind of like, oh, okay, maybe this makes more sense. Like I felt like there's been a lot of areas where I've had a lot of stress, but I've never felt like I don't have any control over what I can do about it.
Yeah, I mean, there's actually like an excellent TED talk that's pretty old now, and there's some nuance missing because she doesn't really get into like she kind of tries to just be like, all stress is good. And it's like, well, there's definitely like, again, like PTSD stress is not really good for anyone, right? Like
Hmm.
being kidnapped and tortured.
Hmm.
Nobody really walks away being like, that was dope and I feel like refreshed, right? Like, that's not the
Hmm.
experience. Let me see if I can find it. I think it's called Stress is Your Friend. Maybe somebody will come up with it in the TED Talk. It's not like one of the TEDx. Yeah, How to Make Stress Your Friend by Kelly McGonigal. It's a really good video. It's old. Like I said, there's missing some nuance, so don't like get like super angry right away.
Hmm.
If you're like, oh, this isn't true. I know you're probably not going to, but I'm posting it in my chat and yours, so
Okay.
people can check it out. But there's actually some evidence that shows actually that if you come across manageable stress and you can kind of have a like, I can overcome this, I can manage this. This is kind of like you kind of have like a bit of like a stoic like amor fati response of like, I love this. This is meaningful to me. It's growing me
Hmm.
as an individual. It's actually healthier for your heart. There's definitely in this TED Talk, she goes through evidence of being people who died most often from stress related causes were people who also believed that stress was really bad for them. So, again, this is where
Yeah,
I get the nuance of being like, okay, well, obviously some stresses just aren't great and nobody's going to think that it's good for them,
for
like
sure.
traumatic
Hmm.
things. But kind of what you're talking about, right? Of like this Twitch debate space where there's just drama all the time and people are fighting and like you're in a debate and people are like grilling you on stuff and the fact that like you enjoy it, like
Hmm.
I think that that's actually a mindset, probably in part that you're probably predilected towards, but also you could
Hmm.
cultivate. And I would argue it's probably healthier for everyone because your heart can either beat really fast and prepare you for dealing with the situation, or you can say, my heart's beating really fast. I'm filled with anxiety. Oh no, I'm doomed,
Yeah.
right? And the
Right.
way your body responds to that stress is different. And in fact, I think in her video, she even talks about how like cortisol levels drop a fair bit. When you have a healthier response to stress, it triggers you to be like more relational and engaged with others. You can try
Hmm.
to reach out. You might engage in more physical forms of touching as well, which is great for like oxytocin. And those things are actually good for heart health. But again, I'm not a doctor and I'm not like specialized in neurotransmitters in the rest of the body. I'm much more like trained in just the brain.
Hmm.
So yeah, I would just check that out. I think it's a really interesting take because I think like we definitely need to have a more complex view of stress because we've definitely been villainizing stress really hard, which is why we try to prevent our kids like I don't want anything bad to ever happen to my kid. And I'm like, I mean,
Hmm.
I don't either, but I recognize it will and I really want to make sure my kid is prepared for that, right?
Yeah, I think the way that I normally talk about this is it seems like we've demonized all forms of challenging experiences,
Yep.
and some challenging experiences are definitely important to development. Yeah.
They're super
Um,
important.
okay, I super pulled you off the DID thing.
That's
Go
okay.
ahead.
Okay, going back, I think I was telling you about the paper. I was talking about amnesia. So there was
Hmm.
another paper that came out just because you were dubious about amnesia. Okay, so yeah,
Hmm.
trauma seems to do. Right, we got onto this because I was talking about highly sensitive children versus non
Hmm.
highly sensitive. Another marker might be something like neuroticism, which is a terrible word because lay people use it to mean like crazy.
Neurotic is bad. Yeah.
Yeah, whereas in like psychology, personality psych, it just means your tendency to feel negative emotions more strongly. Like it's
Hmm.
just like a pretty like basic metric, and
Hmm.
people vary high and low. The main thing to I guess to like where am I going with this with DID? Um, neuroticism is going
People
to be
that are
really
high in neuroticism maybe are more prone to childhood traumas, or what were you
yeah,
were talking
in
about childhood
part,
trauma?
right? Because they're feeling it more intensely than you might be. Their negative emotions are more strong.
Hmm.
But it seems to be the case that people respond to trauma differently, and particularly children. This is actually why the diagnosis of childhood trauma is really difficult because some, so an event might happen to a child, like, trying to think of like TOS safe words to say that are like traumatic. Uh,
You can, I mean, you can say anything as long as you're not being ridiculous.
okay.
Yeah.
So
But like a childhood like
sexual
sexual
assault.
rape or something. Yeah,
Yeah,
sexual assault.
right.
Yeah.
And so like it might have been as like severe as like a form of like grooming and rape that happens to this
Hmm.
child for multiple years, right?
Hmm.
S- if we think about that, we think about PTSD because if that happened, even if it's just one instance, okay, we're going to just use one instance of a sexual assault, right? If that
Hmm.
happened to an adult individual,
Hmm.
there's a decent chance they could develop PTSD, right? There's actually other
Hmm.
things that they can develop as well. They can just develop depression. Some of them just kind of grieve and then kind of bounce back, and then some of them experience something called PTG, post traumatic growth. Um,
Hmm.
but that's kind of what we expect with adults. The problem is that children are kind of weird. Sometimes they'll develop PTSD, especially if they're old enough, or it's severe enough. But children, especially if the person who is harming them is also their caregiver, their system is highly motivated to manage functioning and staying close to that caregiver, even if their caregiver is because we have these two systems, which is behavioral approach system. They're very, very deep old systems. Mammals, lizards even have them, which is that things that reward us we tend to approach again, things that
Mm-hmm.
harm us we tend to avoid. Really basic
Sure.
phenomenon. But if you're a child, if your parent is the thing that harms you, your system in part is going to want to behaviorally avoid, but they also are your caretaker and you're also biologically driven to draw towards them because they provide you
Mm-hmm.
food, safety, comfort, all those things, right? And so you kind of have these two conflicting systems. And what it seems to do in a lot of children is they go, well, this person is really hurting me, but I also really need them. And so, like, basically, like your brain might, as a survival mechanism, be like, let's dial down the importance or even the memory of this harm so that we can manage staying close and our behavioral avoidance system doesn't overtake us. So we can continue to approach parent and be connected and desire like connection with them and do
Mm-hmm.
all the things that facilitate relational connection. It's why it creates such like major attachment issues as they grow older, right? Where they're like, oh, I don't have like PTSD as reactions. Like I'm not having necessarily flashbacks, but it's like every time I notice somebody like pulling away from me, I panic, right? And that's like
Mm-hmm.
it's we can't really call it PTSD because PTSD is a very like unique experience. It's more like this unhealthy form of like coping that develops as a result. And so one way that children with really severe abuse, particularly by their parents, can cope is to shut down those memories. And your brain can go, we're not going to consolidate this. It's not super helpful to our functioning. The problem
Mm-hmm.
is that it gets kind of consolidated and then it gets kind of stored away. We're not entirely sure how. We're not sure if it gets consolidated as just like a somatic memory
Mm-hmm.
that and like the episodic cues of it don't get stored. Like because there's the problem with memory is it's also actually like there's like six forms of memory systems. I think six is probably an overstatement. I think it's maybe four. But
Mm-hmm.
there's multiple memory systems, right? And so it's like, yeah, you don't explicitly remember, but that doesn't mean that you're. There's kind of like a famous book. There's kind of the pop culture one by Bessel van der Kolk, but there was actually the original one by Babette Rothschild, which was like a research heavy book, basically about how the body remembers. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so there was a study that came out that showed of children who had experienced documented reported abuse, 50% of them didn't remember it. Like 50% of them were shocked to find out and like were shown evidence of their abuse and were like literally like shocked, like, I don't remember this. Are you sure that this is real?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas we see those amnesic experiences once trauma is happening later in life really jump down. So it really does seem to be some sort of kind of unique system that's happening for children to protect them and keep them basically able to survive
Mm-hmm.
in connection to their harming parent.
Yeah. So something that I'm always fearful of is I'm sure have you ever heard of the concept of a just so story?
I don't think so actually.
So
Just
something that is a little scary to me about like evolutionary psychology is that it's hard to test like why like we
mm,
can't really know why a thing happens, right?
yeah,
Like we might have like the body does this because of this, but we don't really know. It could be a byproduct of something. It could be because of a totally different reason, or it could be a malfunction, right? I understand that there are explanations for why maybe something should happen, but it seems hard without something else to test it to know why a certain thing happens. But I will say that so the explanation you've given me seems like plausible, I guess. The interesting thing, though, I would be interested if you could link me later or whatever.
mm-hmm.
That study where it shows that like 50% of children with documented trauma don't recall it. That's interesting to me. That would be like a strong indicator that would point towards, oh well, maybe there is like some sort of amnesia event that's happening here. And then that in conjunction with the explanation of like, well, your early caregiver is really important. So maybe it makes sense that the body is trying to find a way to interfere with that
Yeah,
if that early caregiver is not fulfilling their correct role. It sounds, yeah, pretty compelling. I would be interested to see that if you can shoot me that at some point.
absolutely. I'll write it down just so I'm not like distracted
Hmm.
looking for it while we continue to talk. I'm just gonna
The
write it
only
down.
another really big thing why I think that's important, the verified part, is because I know that there was a time period where psychologists, unfortunately,
Yes.
were creating, yeah, so the verified part is
Yes.
important, but you every time you mention, I think you're aware of this because you keep saying that like people took pictures and it was like 100% verified. It wasn't just like the social worker saying something has happened. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, and that's why yeah, that's exactly why I'm bringing verified up is
Hmm.
because there was a period where there was this issue where we started realizing that these fugues happened, and so all these, again, it's these like sometimes things with the best intentions are like lead to like the worst outcomes, right? So these
Hmm.
well-intending therapists, again, who are like not always the most empirical or not the most empirically careful, were like, oh, that makes
Hmm.
so much sense for so many of my clients, and so they started
Hmm.
digging and being like, well, is it possible? And they would have these like leading questions, and they weren't doing it because they're like, I want to have my clients have all trauma. They were trying to offer just a solution of being like, maybe this is why you're struggling so much, right? They were
Hmm.
genuinely trying to help, but what happened is that there was a lot of cases of legitimately falsified and false memories formed, and it's actually part of because there was a really interesting study that came out of UBC by a master's student that proved unequivocally that within like 6 months, it's not that hard to create very complex false memories. It's actually
Hmm.
why eyewitness testimony. She did it in regard to eyewitness testimony
Hmm.
because there's a big movement within at least like judicial areas in Canada to just more or less remove eyewitness accounts if they haven't been recorded within 24 hours of the event happening because
Hmm.
of the just the memory system's erosion over time. Seems to be pretty quick.
Yeah. And not even, I think I would even phrase it a little bit more strongly. It's not even so much the memory system's erosion, is that I think that, especially with the advent of computers, it feels like we have a pretty bad way of understanding how we recall events and everything. We seem to think that we kind of like create these memories in our brain as like these kind of like bit perfect copies of like, well, this is a picture of that and we remember the sound, when you're kind of like more actively involved in recreating a memory every time you bring it up and like lacking some details. I thought the way they explained it in Inception was interesting, that like in a dream, you only have to create certain parts and then the mind will fill in the rest. And that is absolutely true, that only given some
Mm-hmm.
details, your mind can fill in a lot of extra information that was not there initially.
It's
But
doing
it
it
just
right
seems like it
now
would be.
as you're awake.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, like I
Oh
mean,
yeah, yeah, because you don't have the perception right now that you can't see things in your peripheral vision,
yep,
but your resolution there is very, very, very poor.
yeah.
But it doesn't feel that way. It feels like you see everything like exactly as you're supposed to. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if you've ever seen like the YouTube video where they have you count the volleyball as they pass the ball in
With
between
the gorilla.
themselves. Yeah, yeah, with the
Hmm.
gorilla in the center, right? That's just a good demonstration of like, in fairness, like people who are more likely to potentially be like ADHD tend to fail that test. They tend to see the gorilla right away.
Hmm.
But in general, it's a show of like when you highly attend to things, you absolutely exclude like major things like a monkey dancing in the middle. And it was like upwards of 60% of participants who had that gorilla test didn't see
Hmm.
the gorilla, right?
Yeah.
So absolutely, like that's why eyewitness testimony is like so careful. Like, well, did he have a blue hat or a black hat? And it's like they probably didn't even notice.
Didn't even have a hat or
They didn't
something,
even
or like,
notice when they were looking at the guy, let alone 24 hours later, let alone 2 weeks
hmm.
later, right? Like, what's the
Hmm.
likelihood that they remember?
And
Um,
something that is so frustrating to me, I took an AP Psych class one time, and it's probably the best class I've ever taken in my life. There's so many interesting things about like human memory and cognition, whatever.
mhm.
Everything related to priming is so interesting to me. That like just the way that you ask a question, and I don't even mean like, don't we all hate noodles? Like, what do we think about noodles? But like just like the way that you phrase a question can have such a huge impact on the survey results or whatever.
Oh yeah.
Um, yeah,
Even
one of the
just like
biggest
the
reasons.
music you play. Like if I play soothing music while we're talking, you're probably more
Mhm,
likely to be agreeable and nice to me,
sure.
right?
Hmm. And the yeah, for sure. Yeah, and then like things like one of the big reasons why you should never talk to the cops is because you might say something dumb and you don't even realize what you're saying,
Hmm.
because our default is like being really trusting of other people, and we'll offer more details than we need to, and we'll kind of like, because we always assume that people are acting in good faith generally is like our default assumption. Yeah, there's a lot of like interesting stuff there for sure.
Yeah, yeah. I definitely once you get into kind of that's more like the realm of like cognitive psychology.
Hmm.
It's kind of like scary. It makes you be like, wait, are we just in a matrix? Like, but is the matrix just our brains? Like,
Hmm.
yeah. Once you like get into that, it kind of like blows your mind and really makes you question a lot of stuff. And I think what's most important about that sort of stuff is that it gives a lot of weight to like non-conscious processing and how important it actually is, because most of this stuff is happening I mean, there's an entire visual pathway in your brain that is completely non-conscious, that just like you
Hmm.
aren't aware of happening and you respond to it all the time. And even if we destroy your conscious brain, your conscious visual system in your brain,
Hmm.
you will report seeing nothing, but you'll to some extent be able to interact with the world like you can see it. to a
Mm-hmm.
certain extent. It's called blind sight. It's a really interesting kind of case study of a woman who had blind sight from a stroke, where she couldn't see
Interesting.
anything, but she could like put mails, like a piece of mail, in a mailbox slot, regardless of the orientation or placement of it, right? So she was
Gotcha.
like, I don't see anything. I don't see a mailbox, and they're like, that's okay, just try, and she'd get it in perfectly almost every time, or like she would bump the edge and then get it in, just like kind of you would expect actually with anyone putting a
Mm-hmm.
thing of mail in. Yeah, really fast. The brain is an enigma, man. It's crazy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
True.
Um,
Okay.
should we go back to DID?
Um, I think I got. I think I'm getting the gist of what you're. I'm picking up what you're putting down.
Okay.
Or you seem to that one study about children not being able to recall like well documented experiences would be interesting to me. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I like I said, I don't have it on me, but I will send it to you after like this chat, basically.
Mm-hmm.
One last study for DID I actually do want to go through was showing actually marked brain differences in people with DID when they were in their other states that we couldn't like even falsely create in people who we call them high fantasy prone individuals, which I think is
Mm-hmm.
actually probably a term that would be really helpful for you to understand probably lots of people on the internet, because I would imagine more people who are engaged in online stuff and stuff are going to be they tend to just be people who are more gullible. You can put them under hypnosis more often. This isn't to be
Mm-hmm.
like they're lesser than, but they're people who are engaging kind of like fantastic thinking more often than people who are like really low in it. And so, as you could presume, you can kind of convince them to believe that they have maybe split personalities when they don't, through educating
Mm-hmm.
them, which I don't actually know how the study happened, because I would argue like most ethics boards I feel like would strike this study down, but it happened.
Yeah, fuck. I'm trying to think of what you're talking about because I think I've had somebody argue against me. It might have been the last girl I argued about with D&D. I wish I could remember. I was playing Rust, and I knew on the map I was running around when she was talking about this. But basically, there was a study where they tried to. I don't know if they told the people that they were studying D, but they tried to present something basically in the way that the people engaged with the questions. It was like, oh, there's actually like there seems to be a fundamentally different cognitive process that exists here. It's not like just somebody completely faking something that like there was some other type of recall or some other type of memory recall where it's like they scored really high on this particular thing and that was pretty consistent with these people were way more likely to have DID or something. Maybe we're not talking about exactly the same study, but
I don't think it's the exact same study. There's been a lot of studies on DID
uh-huh.
people. The main thing is that they went under an MRI basically, and what we saw is
Oh,
that
okay,
like
this is something different then. Okay.
when you're at a resting brain state, everyone has a bit of like a resting brain, almost like thumbprint a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
and it is unique between individuals, and there'll be obvious overlap between all individuals, but it's going
Mm-hmm.
to look a little bit different between all people. And so the key thing is if you're resting and then we trigger you to be in a different personality, if you have a legitimate separate personality, theoretically we might see that the resting brain waves differ while you're in that state, basically. And so they
Mm-hmm.
tested this by having low fantasy prone people, high fantasy prone people who are the best, who are like the closest controls we could have to DID people, and people who are
Mm-hmm.
diagnosed with DID. And we compared, and basically we trained we trained the controls, the low and high fantasy prone people, basically about DID. We taught them how basically, because actually with DID people you can trigger alters to come out through different like sensory cues or verbal cues, stuff like that. So they trained them basically on that, taught them a lot about kind of intrafamilial systems therapy and how we all have different parts to us and how you can draw these parts are, and in some cases they can even be full separate identities, and the other identities are actually non-conscious at that time, right? So as you can imagine, low fantasy prone people were kind of like, this is bullshit, I don't think that actually happens for me. High fantasy
Mm-hmm.
prone people were probably more like, oh, that's really interesting, I wonder if it happens to me, I bet you it does happen. And then you kind of convinced them that it could happen to them. And then we had DID individuals that we did no education with, and then we put them in an MRI and just looked at their their resting brain waves
Uh-huh.
between basically alters, and we'd be like, okay, and we would basically, they don't go into details in the study about how they triggered precisely, probably for ethical reasons why they didn't go into it, just because you
Mm-hmm.
don't want to like teach random people reading your article
People
how
how
to
to
like
trigger,
trigger
yeah.
swaps and stuff like that. Um, so, anyways, what we saw was that there was a pretty marked difference in the DID people when they swapped, and there wasn't this difference in the resting brainwaves in high prone individuals when they claimed they had swapped personalities.
Gotcha. Okay,
Yeah.
interesting.
So it's definitely interesting. I think DID is still going to be contentious for a while, in large part because it's like, how do you see who's faking or not?
Mm-hmm.
because you can't just stick everyone under an MRI, obviously, either, right?
Yeah.
So
It was interesting that in the beginning of this conversation, I feel like I've talked about this like 3 different times with 3 different psychologists who've all come on to talk about like DID. It was interesting at the beginning of this conversation, you brought up the frustration with the sometimes the overvaluation of like clinical psychologists versus research psychologists, and that was the main criticism that I'd heard in the DAD. I'm sorry, in the DSM-5. For the only reason DID made it in there was because the DSM-5 overrepresented for clinical psychologist experience versus researcher experience, and a lot of researchers were upset because they were like, "Oh, well, you guys you're not taking us seriously enough. Like, it shouldn't even be in here, or whatever." So it's interesting that you come from the research side, but you seem to be on the opposite side of that for the DID thing, or maybe the research has changed also because the DSM-5 is pretty old at this point, right? Like, how many?
well, the DSM-4 that they're referring to had multiple personality disorder. They just called it multiple personality disorder. They didn't have
Mhm.
DID. It was just labeled something. That's kind of what I'm
Well, I
confused
think
on. I mean,
the
like, which DSM did they think didn't have it? Because the DSM-4 TR did
mhm.
have multiple personality disorder as a diagnosis, and the DSM-5 just changed it to a dissociative identity disorder.
Yeah, I think the thing that my understanding of what was frustrating was the concept of dissociative amnesia. I think is still somewhat contentious because I
Yes.
think there's still a lot of debate over what even is a dissociative experience or is dissociative amnesia possible. And there are so few cases of this; it's hard to get like a big quantitative, like, oh, like we gathered 280,000 patients with DID, and this is what we researched. It's really hard. A lot of it is still built on case studies, and then historically speaking. I'm sure that there's still like a lot of iffy people in the field because of the Sybil girl or whatever. Um, are you familiar with her?
No.
There was one girl whose her case study was like I think the landmark case study for multiple personalities,
Hmm.
and I think near her death, basically it was revealed that everything was fake. It was all complete bullshit. Um, and I think that probably was a big setback for a lot of that research as well. Um, or at least a lot of people were willing to engage with it. So yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm sure. Yeah.
Yeah, and like I think there's a fair hesitation within the field, and I even though I'm saying I believe in it, I wouldn't
Mhm,
even discourage the hesitation. I think the hesitation is well founded and wise, and we should probably maintain hesitation around it. Um,
mhm,
I'm just on the side of basically saying like I believe that there are. I believe that there are dissociative disorders. I'm not sure to what extent I believe about this like full amnesic stuff, but as somebody who is like been friends with people who I find very credible and had also they kind of had like so there is something called OSDD, which is like other specified dissociative disorder. So it's like dissociative disorders that aren't necessarily dissociative identity. So what you might
mhm,
like disappear a little bit and operate and have like a massive gap in your memory, but you wouldn't really
mhm,
call it like a separate identity came out.
mhm,
There's a varied number of these things, and I am friends with somebody who literally like they claim that they did experience it and that those parts integrated, and they do remember like waking up like after 2 hours and having like stolen stuff and being like, I really don't remember this, and through like trauma and like EMDR and like reprocessing trauma and stuff like that, they were able to like integrate those things and they no longer experience it, right? And so when I hear about things like that, I'm like, there's the brain is so wild and crazy that it while we should be hesitant, we've had so many. I think like I don't. Do you know the researcher Ramachandran?
well, I do, but you might want to refresh them for chat, of
Sure.
course.
Yeah, he's just
Well
basically like
read
a,
people.
a really popular neuroscientist. He really studies a lot about like neuroplasticity and kind of he's at like the avant-garde basically of like
Mhm,
neurological research, and he talks a lot about this idea of like I struggle because I feel like all my researchers and peers are saying, show me a talking pig. And then I'm like, okay, ready? And then I wave a wand over a pig and then it talks. And I'm like, here's a
mhm,
talking pig. And then all my peers go, yeah, but show me another, right? And
mhm,
so I think what we're at like with brain science right now is like we know so much that now we know that we know so very little. And brains are so incredibly flexible and
mhm,
changeable based on like experiences that it's hard to like pin your hand down and say like this is absolutely can't be true because so many we've seen like phantom limbs be like cured by like an illusion box, right? And it's like you just
mhm.
never would have expected that to ever be possible, but it does, and now it's a standard treatment for phantom limb pain. So
Okay.
I think that's the trick is just like, and this is why I'm like diagnosis is actually really complicated because like in part the brain is an enigma and we have to be careful with our diagnoses and like you should be having like I don't a hot take, I don't even think general practitioner like doctors should be diagnosing mental health problems. I actually don't think that they have the training required for it because of the nature of where we're at with like neuroscience and stuff. Like we don't know enough.
Mm-hmm.
That like unless you're really versed on like complex things and how drugs, I mean, there's cases of like people diagnosed with ADHD as children, they go on drugs, it turns out that all along they had OCD, but because of the stimulants they also developed Tourette's syndrome, right? Like there's crazy stuff that happens with like misdiagnosis, which is why I think we have to be careful. We have to do this weird balance of being conservative and careful, but also open-minded to the fact that like there's probably so much we don't know about the brain right now, and in 10 years we're
Mm-hmm.
going to be looking back and like laughing at ourselves.
Yeah, maybe, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, well, anything
Yeah.
else?
Trying to think about anything else. I'm trying to think about how long we've been going for too. I don't want to take up too much of your time. Because I think you have a chat with somebody else pretty soon here, correct?
Yeah, but if there's anything else you can think of, we can. Any other big
Uh,
talking points, anything?
yeah. The main one would be therapy. I think that there's. I think I have a differing perspective on therapy than maybe you do. On like the purpose of it. Um, that's probably different than a lot of people potentially within the field. Probably not a ton of
Mm-hmm.
people, but a number of them, which is basically kind of the argument of like, should therapy be short term or long term?
Mm-hmm.
And kind of what goes into that. I think like, um, I think short term therapy really came around because of insurance, first and foremost.
Mm-hmm.
I absolutely think that there are short term forms of therapy that are valid, are good, and should be used. The problem is that we see like the effects of therapy um, don't seem to last super long, and I think that that's an important thing to talk about of like we've really medicalized mental health when I think that probably we need to have a different lens of how we view mental health, in part because I think the medicalization has led to kind of some of this hopelessness. I'm just this, and so there's no point anymore, right? I just have depression, so there's no point in trying anymore. um,
Mm-hmm.
and so I actually like really try to challenge people on therapy of being like, absolutely, therapy is there to like present you with skills. Those short-term forms of therapy where they give you some basic CBT skills, some basic mindfulness skills, they kind of give you some psychoeducation, and they like give you some positive rapport even, and just
Mm-hmm.
like nice interactions for a couple weeks, can absolutely be beneficial. The problem is that like we see the effects of it wane off pretty quickly, and so
Mm-hmm.
it feels like the and this is kind of the argument for why some people do short-term therapy is because therapy wanes off after time. But what we do see in like there are some studies that show like people who do long-term therapy, while the effects may be more slow because they do maybe like a psychodynamic approach,
Mm-hmm.
they actually lead to more stable changes long term because they're just immersing their client for like 2 years into like a um, different way of like viewing their whole world and like grieving and processing their experiences of the past and like getting to have like a new narrative and kind of like well, psychodynamics might call it like you're kind of like taking your present self and sending it back in time to rescue your like child self and stuff like that, right? Which
Mm-hmm.
is very like artsy and floozy, but there's definitely some evidence coming out that like these longer forms of therapy, while it's kind of obnoxious that they're so long because we can't pay for it,
Mm-hmm.
um, they seem to
I
have more stable impacts long term.
Something that would be so I can't disagree with you because I'm pretty sure everything you're saying is 100% correct. But the only difference is, or the interesting part is that it feels like you're placing a fundamentally different or greater burden on mental health than we would around health,
Hmm.
or physical health, I should say. So I think that when we go to hospitals, the primary goal is that they're moving you to a place where you're basically not dying,
Yeah.
or like your body is like has some minimal level of functioning, and that's like the goal when we go to a hospital. When I go to a hospital, I expect them to fix, if I have like some like an infarction or if I'm having like some serious medical, I expect them to fix that. But I don't expect to go to a hospital to get like better cardiovascular health or like better like more muscles or whatever. I wouldn't expect that from a hospital.
Yeah.
But it feels like when we talk about mental health, this idea of like the infinity therapy is we're no longer talking about just like curing ailments or whatever, but we're talking about like a long term, like making somebody healthy, not just not dying, which I guess is a far bigger burden than what we would expect of like traditional medicine, I guess.
Yeah. That's a really, really good point and an important point, and it's actually why I argue. So, part of why I have this view is because I think actually a lot of mental health practitioners, practitioners occupy a space where normally community and mentors would traditionally probably have filled.
Or sometimes even like, unfortunately, parents, right? Or
Mhm.
just friends, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, parents or friends, right? And I think it's kind of this like modern solution we have to a modern problem, right? It's kind of that thing that sometimes people talk about of like we have all these modern problems, and then we like rather than like giving it like the simplest answer, being like, why don't we just like have healthier communities? We're like, no, we're going to create this new field and train all these specialists to go out there and be professional friends and mentors to everyone. And rather than exchanging like basically like tit for tat a relationship of being like, I'll mentor you now if you like care for me when I'm an old person because I don't have children, instead you're
Mm-hmm.
just going to give me money, right? That's kind of like the tit for tat we trade now. And so I definitely agree to an extent. I think like the problem is that I actually suspect that we have mental health problems that are like much more like biological and more medical in nature. Like
Mm-hmm.
but there's kind of depression is being now split into like a biological form of depression versus a stress depression, right? A stress
Mm-hmm.
depression, to be honest, like you can go to a therapist, and I would encourage you to if that's like what would solve you. But a lot of times, what solves stress depressions is removing the major stressors that are making you depressed, right? If your boss is a bastard to you all the time, probably the best way
Mm-hmm.
to solve that is to find a new workplace, which is, again, easier said than done for a lot of people. But sometimes the reason people are depressed is because their life has been really terrible, right?
Yeah, and I think the problem is that and that's kind of, so maybe we agree, maybe we don't disagree, I guess, but like it feels like we're asking medical health professionals to solve for like environments, which is impossible.
Yes.
Um, like no amount of medication or therapy is going to do as much for depression as like huge fundamental lifestyle changes.
Yeah.
And I would say probably even in the case of like medical, real major depressive
Mm-hmm.
disorder, like even in that case, like things like a better diet, better sleep schedule, better social functioning, are going to do more for you than just than just like having medication and therapy. But it's the problem. The reason why people are probably asking so much of the therapist and everything is that it's changing all of society is a lot harder than just creating a new discipline to kind of like band-aid the problems, I guess. is the
Yeah.
difficult thing.
Yeah, I agree. I like that's the problem though is like as a psychologist, I try to steer away from like trying to advocate strongly for major social changes because I recognize
Hmm.
that I'm probably not the most informed. I can give you my opinion, but it's not my
Hmm.
professional opinion, it's my personal opinion, right? About
Yeah.
being like, yeah, I would like to see like systems in Sweden where they have like these community living apartments where they like have to share a kitchen area, and they have to
Hmm.
have like one meal together, and they get reduced rent, and it's the whole idea is it's kind of the government forcing people to have community, right?
Yeah.
I absolutely would be for that. I agree with you. There's strong evidence. Something like schizophrenia, which we would call a very biological mental health
Hmm.
problem, it experiences remission in like Latina and like African villages way more often than it ever does in like North America. Like people with schizophrenia, honestly, they do better in Latin American countries broadly,
Hmm.
which is like crazy because their medical interventions for it of getting them on like tranks and stuff like that um, are way less, which is super interesting. So
Hmm.
I definitely would agree. Probably most mental health problems could be better adjusted for by just making societal wide changes, right? As we've reduced religion in our culture, whether you think that's good or bad, it has removed a major form of like community bonding that was happening. So how do we
Hmm.
replace that in a less religious society? Well, we need to figure that out because people are sad, anxious, and depressed. And most of that can be fixed by just giving them friends. And right now we're
Hmm.
band-aiding it by giving them like a mental health therapist
Therapist. Yeah.
and some CBT skills. But CBT skills won't fix your problems if your problems are that you just like don't have intimate relationships with people where you feel seen, right?
Hmm.
And so I definitely think that like we probably actually agree on this more than I originally like presumed. I just wanted to be
Hmm.
clear of like I think short-term therapy is actually like I value it a lot less than
Hmm.
probably like a lot more, and I think the reason why it even like came into existence is largely because insurance didn't want to pay for long form
Gotcha.
therapy.
And
Yeah.
you support long-term therapy, and not necessarily long-term therapy, but more so that like we have to recognize that to fix some problems in our lives, it's not going to be like a 2 months of sessions and then you're done.
And then you're
Now you
fixed for
fixed all of your interpersonal problems if no other
yeah.
changes in your life are happening. Yeah.
Yeah, and my view of long-term therapy isn't like you should be in therapy for 10 years straight. once a week every week. My view is like probably you need to be in for like 2 to 3 months every week. And after that, you should probably do check-ins like once every 6 months, once every year, kind of like a doctor more so. But it should actually be more standardized of like you just do your check-ins, because it's like if we have these people as band-aids for now, probably the better system is to allow them to continue to be band-aids. Obviously, if we could have social reform that changes that, if we have more community living that maybe happens or something like that, I'd be more for
Hmm.
that. But that's just not the world that we live in right now.
Unfortunately, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess one last question somebody recommended I ask is, do you have any recommendations for me on Twitch and where I should go from here?
I don't know. Do the panel shows. It's good to have women that aren't fucking insane on this platform. Um, I think that generally the stereotype is true that like if you have women on the platform, they tend to be like very ultra super far left on everything, and that's like going to be the point of view. So I think it's good to have like more moderating voices. I think is really positive. So yeah, I mean, keep doing the panel shows and have the representation is good. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Anyone you
Um,
think I should like talk to specifically or reach out to?
yeah, there's a one of the most intellectual debaters on the platform goes by the name Demon Mama. Um,
Oh no.
yeah, this is somebody very well versed background in psychology. I think it'd be interesting to talk to them. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we disagree on most things. She's the individual who's really pro self-diagnosis, correct?
You know, I don't want to taint your view of that person, and I think you should go in with an
Don't
open
want to
mind.
poison the well.
Okay,
That's
instead of
fair.
being, yeah, don't be so close-minded that who knows what they believe.
True.
It changes day to day. So,
True.
um, yeah, I think I don't know. Like, the problem is that like this is gonna sound self-congratulatory. I'll talk to anybody, but the people that I tend to have the biggest disagreements with seem not to all the time. So yeah, I don't know. I like talking to one of those people that have a huge disagreement, but with you have an educated background would be interesting. The frustrating thing for me is that like I said, like usually when I talk to like really educated people, we're usually agreeing on like 98% of things.
Yeah.
But then whenever I talk to people that disagree with me, they say that like, oh, like, you're just looking for people that agree with you. You just circle jerk all the time. Like, you don't engage with the data. But it's like, okay, well, I mean, I try. Like, find me somebody that disagrees with me, and we can have that conversation. But they never seem to want to. So,
Yeah, that's fair and frustrating for sure.
you can also try talking to Vosh too. That's another guy that Demon Mama Jason. Maybe he would be interested in it. So,
Okay. All right, I'll keep those names on the list. I know a lot of people keep saying Mr. Girl, but I don't know if that's just because he's kind of like the popular person to talk to right now. 'Cause
oh
he's got a
yeah,
lot of
he's
like,
definitely interesting. But my frustrating thing with Mr. Girl is you'll end up agreeing. I think you'll end up agreeing with 99% of what he says, but it's only once you've chewed through the kind of the weird, I'll call it semantic garbage. So like I might say something like, therapy is horrible. Nobody should be in therapy. And then you'll be like, well, what do you mean by that? Isn't therapy important? It's like, no. What you should have is a relationship with somebody that maybe you have to pay some amount of money to talk to every now and then to get through your problems. But therapy is garbage. Like it'll be like
right.
something like that. I'm like, okay, sure.
Okay.
But yeah, it might be interesting to chat with him. He's a very interesting guy to chat with. So I definitely wouldn't discourage it. But yeah.
Okay. Okay. Awesome. Well, if you ever want to chat again, or you come across stuff that you would like to address around psychology, or a view you come across,
Mm-hmm.
definitely don't be hesitant to hit you up, and I'll try to pay attention to your stuff and see if there's anything else I hear of in the future that I have strong contentions over.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just let me know
Okay.
if I say anything you disagree with. So yeah, have fun.
Okay. Sounds good.
Bye.
Okay. Bye. Okie dokie. Thanks to everyone who popped in. I appreciated it a lot. I don't hear my music anymore. I think it died, didn't it? Yes, it did. Um, yeah, cool, cool, cool. Thank you. I mean, didn't know. The main one I brought up IQ because I honestly just assumed we might disagree more on that one because I would say more people have like spicy opinions on it than anything else. But unfortunately, we mostly just agreed on it. So I was like, oh shoot, I thought that was going to be a much longer conversation. Um, so yeah. Are you willing to answer some questions, or was the conversation enough? Sure, I can answer questions for like another probably 30 minutes, and then I am getting decently tired though. I did sleep super well last night, so but yeah, I can definitely answer some questions. I know a bunch of you were posting questions during the chat. Just so you guys have a heads up, I do have a brain injury, and so it causes me to A, swap words sometimes, and B, I'm pretty bad at multitasking. So if I'm talking with people, I basically have to ignore chat or I derail myself. Just so you guys know. Thanks. Thanks for the conversation. I enjoyed it as well. I know that there was like lots of drama yesterday, and it's pretty obvious that he didn't want to get into it. So I wanted to be, because I think there's a lot of conversations that can come from that outside of it, but I didn't want to go into it because I respect people's decisions about their own like personal experiences, I guess. I like when you agreed with Destiny 2. Get to join in with the true bonding. Yes. One question. What would long-term therapy look like? It seems like mental health sector is already overburdened. I would say it is both overburdened and underburdened. The biggest issue is that private mental health care is extremely expensive. And so it's just wild. It's pretty much impossible to do long-term therapy right now. So even though I'm saying like I advocate broadly for like those check-ins, and that's part of why I say I wouldn't say you should be going every week for 10 years straight. No one can even afford that. I would say like the first 2 months probably you should be going weekly, but work with your counselor obviously on that. And then after that, I like to see like a slow reduction, and then I encourage check-ins. So usually once people are like, okay, we've kind of figured everything out, they end, and then they just kind of never go back. I would encourage you actually like go back even just like once a year, or in any time where like maybe you have like a big emotional thing come up that might connect to stuff you had talked about in therapy, that it might be good to kind of get that outside perspective on again, to just kind of like get your brain like back on being like feeling seen, validated, and being like, okay, yeah, like this is me, this is what I believe, stuff like that. Yeah, so good question. You're one of the few psychologists that actually admit that you can't establish causality, more or less. Yeah, you can't, right? Like you can get as close as you possibly can, but you can't say things cause. It's really hard to do that in psychology. Your point that we're trying to replace other social support with mentor with shrinks is really interesting. Thanks. Yeah, I think broadly like society has, like I don't think that our society just suddenly had mental health problems. It suggests to me that like we changed something on modernity, that some again unexpected traditional thing that we were doing probably accounted for. It's kind of that issue of like we accidentally threw the baby out with the bathwater. I don't think we ever intentionally do that, right? It's kind of like we don't expect, because our society is so complex, we don't expect that like as we like got more insular family systems, that mentorship would disappear with it, right? And so like there's definitely one thing to having like a parent validate your feelings, but then there's a whole other thing to have some outside adult or individual who has no motivation to care about you at all, other than they just do. Like there's something special about that, and those people I think can offer really unique insights into yourself. Like I'm really passionate about like mentorship in general, because I think like even for myself, having like people in my life who I like aren't my family, that I've been able to talk to and just process my life through and just like make sense of certain experiences, has been like really helpful. EQ. It's invested in my uni, but I don't know if it's real or a useful term. So it's probably a real thing, right? Like, in general, my like view is like if something catches fire with enough people, there's probably something true to it. The problem is that we can't measure it very well. It's not really a validated measure. They're trying to, but it seems to be the case that the things we measure and we claim as EQ is probably just as well accounted for with like agreeableness on the personality tests, like the big five personality tests. So yeah, I feel like I answered that. Hopefully that was concise enough. I left my mental health team because my addictions counselor left, and my psychosis therapist was getting fed up with me. I'm really sorry about that. That's really tough. Yeah, having transitions between therapists can be tough, because I think a lot of therapists, we try to be like, it's not about the therapist, it's about like the empathy. And I'm like, it absolutely is about the relationship though as well, right? Like if you feel close to somebody and then they leave, you don't want to have to like, even just the fact that you have to like unpack all of your burdens again, it sucks. I think that's why a lot of times we like end up trauma dumping on our like partner sometimes, because it's like they know you and they're consistent, and they can give you insights, and it's just really helpful to not have to explain all the intricacies of you, because they already get it, so they can give you those insights because they're like, I get you. Whereas anytime you get a new therapist, you have to go through that process, which like you're paying to just be like teaching your therapist who you are. And if you don't know who you are, it's more frustrating, because you're like, I think this is who I am, but I don't really know. So yeah. 10 factor or the Big Five personality traits. Yeah, Big Five is probably the most validated personality psych test there. It's probably not done. There's right now, I think there's a thought of splitting one of the traits up into two, so we might have like a 6 factor, which is just like an over encapsulation of like broadly what your psyche is, right? And so it's going to be extremely generalized. And a big thing to keep in mind is personality tests are almost never predictive of future behavior. They're more descriptions of patterns that you've had. Could long-term treatment come in the form of support networks, patients meeting with experts based on all experiences? This is actually why I'm really pro group therapy, because I think group therapy could be a really easy solution to the cost thing. Because as soon as you have group therapy, if everyone's contributing to pay the counselor, you all have to pay them less for the counselor to still make really good money for like even an hour's worth of work, right? If it's, say it's like $220 for an individual session, well, if you replace the individual session with 10 people, well, each of you could potentially just pay $22, right? That's way more affordable. You can go for a lot longer. You're also building a network of people who are like-minded, who are learning the same things you are, or going through the same things. I'm very aggressively pro group therapy, and I don't know why psychology doesn't do it more. I think it intimidates practitioners. Knowing who you are. I think a lot of times, like especially as we're young adults, like we're just kind of forming our identity. And so when people say like, are you a people person or not? We'll be like, I'm a people person. And then maybe like 10 years later, we'll find out like, I'm not really a people person. I was just really lonely when I was young, right? So learning who you are is just difficult because sometimes it's hard to disentangle like coping behaviors that are part of who you are, but they're not necessarily like your core personality. They've just like evolved as a process. And so you could argue that is who you are then. You've just changed who you are. So it's kind of based on whether or not you want to view that as like, that is who you were, it's just changed, or who you were was consistent the whole time. There was just kind of these extra things on top that were causing certain coping or behavior patterns that maybe aren't completely consistent to actually like how you view things. Yeah. Okay, I'm just gonna, okay. Not so erudite, and hey, you could slow the transition into group therapy into community wellness checks and eventually get that community living. Yeah, I actually have like a really big passion about community living. I think it's really, really important. And it seems like we're really bad at it now. But it's definitely something I want to like have in the future. I want to run like a treatment center in the future. And I would love to see some sort of community living that comes out of it. I've actually made the model. I guess I'm kind of like, do I like tell you my model and then risk somebody like else learning about it and then jacking it? Because I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. But yeah, I'm really passionate about community living. On the relationship side, what should I do if I'm pursuing a relationship with women who plays games of it? If you don't pursue me hard enough, so you don't like me. I mean, I guess probably the question has to be like, if you don't like that, you probably shouldn't pursue her. If you find it kind of exciting and it adds like tension or romanticism and you're willing to do it, I guess like if that's what she's asking for, like be willing to engage. But if you're like, this kind of stresses me out, I really prefer just like explicit consent. I don't really want to like dance around and like try to figure out the implied stuff. I just want to say, can I kiss you now? And you be like, yes. And that just be really nice and enjoyable, right? So just kind of deciding if like the fact that she's saying you don't pursue me hard enough so you don't like me might cue you to other traits that she has. And I can't say what they could be because there's lots of reasons why people might say something like that. But you just have to figure out if that's something you're even going to want in a partner, and then I guess do it if you want to. Is it difficult for practitioners who have a client who is educated in psychology? I imagine so. Somebody asked previously what my credentials are. So I have an undergrad in, sorry, I'm stumbling over my words. So I have an undergrad in psychology. I did an honors thesis. So it's like a master's dissertation in a year. Some would argue it's less complex. Mine was 2 studies, whereas a lot of master's thesis can be like 3 to 4 studies. Mine was 2, but I still did it under a year, including like ethics and everything, and like I ran my own data. Then I became a licensed addictions counselor, kind of a little bit by accident. I kind of stumbled into it, and then I went back to school to become a psychometrist because my ultimate plan is to become a psychologist, but every clinical psychologist I talk to highly encouraged me to get extra training in diagnosis because they feel that that's actually an area that they wish they knew more on and like testing. So I'm a psychometrist, and then I'm going into school to do my master's in um, clinical psychology. Yeah. And I'm a program director of a mental health program. So I spend most days, every day, is reading literature and research and getting really updated on like what we know about certain mental health topics today. But I'm definitely not like a registered psychologist right now myself. I'm never trying to like come from the space of like I'm an authority on everything. Usually, if people like, is that true? My main authority is being like I have lots of data. Like I know the research. I could be wrong because the research could be wrong in 5 years. Like absolutely, that happens all the time. I don't ever want people to feel like I'm using appeal to authority from like my credentials in general because I find that a little bit cringy. I want you to like I appreciate when people are like, what's your data for this? I love that question because I'm usually like, here's the data on it. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. My job currently is I am a program director for an online mental health program. I do a lot of public speaking and education on mental health with that job, and I am a addictions counselor, but I am not like a therapist. I've done like a number of practicums and stuff. I kind of have a mod podge of training. But yeah, I'm not a registered psychologist, just to be like super clear. Any advice for how to get somebody to talk to a therapist when they're very paranoid, such as a conspiracy theorist? In general, I'm going to be honest, advice is really hard to give on these types of mediums because I just don't know anything about the details. So the best you can give is like generally this is like the general recommendations. It's probably not going to be that unique compared to like what you can just Google. The problem is that you like can't force anyone to do anything unless you like form you basically like declare them like mentally incapable of making safe decisions for themselves, which is I think a legal process, and you'd have to look into that for wherever you're from. In that case, you can basically force them to go to a mental hospital where they have to talk to a psychiatrist. So that's basically like if they're an adult, that's the only way you can like force somebody to go see a psychiatrist is to like um, apply to have them basically like detained for their own safety. So they're not like arrested. They're usually like brought to a mental hospital for their safety. Is kind of how it's viewed. But it's actually depending on where you're from, it can be really really hard to do that. Like they don't grant it easily because it's obviously a massive infraction on somebody's like right to freedom. Okay, thoughts on Jordan Peterson? Not trying to bait you. Yeah, I'm broadly pro Jordan Peterson. I don't know what he's doing recently, so I can't like speak as strongly. But overall, I think he's a really good psychologist. I think he's pretty empirically sound. I'll have to think about some of the takes Destiny had. I think I respect Destiny and I respect Jordan Peterson a lot, so I want to think about his argument a little bit more. But I haven't had as much opposition to some of his political takes, but um, probably maybe in part because I tend to more watch his psychological stuff anyways, because that's going to be what interests me. So if there's specific political takes I might be opposed to, I'm not sure. I'd have to think about it. Any thoughts on gaming addiction? I think like any behavioral addiction, it can obviously exist if you're like literally like leaving your family behind, you're like missing birthdays, you're missing work, you're not sleeping, you're not taking care of yourself because of gaming, then yeah, there's a problem. The best form of treatment I've heard of so far is there is like some rehab centers that are literally in the middle of nowhere. So you have no access to the internet and they basically just like detox you and then train you about it. But anything that's addicting is difficult. And the tricky thing in a modern world is if gaming is your addiction, you pretty much have to have a computer. And so to like avoid it is really hard. And it's really hard once you're addicted to something to like recover and then just have a healthy relationship. It's not impossible. People definitely do it all the time. It just kind of, I think, depends in part how severe maybe you were before you went through kind of getting some help. Um, do you think, it feels like it would pray to a concept that happens in engineering called cumulative tolerance. Do you think that influences when this gap exists? Let me look up what cumulative tolerance. Okay. series of events that have a cumulative effect, each event making the effect greater. Okay. Probably. I don't know what you're referring to specifically in that question. I make tacos, but yeah, I definitely think cumulative, what is this called? Cumulative tolerance is probably for sure thing. We don't talk about it in psychology, but maybe we should. What kind of mental health professionals are the most reliable for screening for a correct diagnosis? um, psychiatrists psychiatrists seem to be either really, really good or really not great. Um, but arguably they should be the best at it. Um, I overall find clinical psychologists to be the best at it. Um, but it seems to really vary from individual to individual because something like this just isn't really standardized, and it's an area within the field of like we really do need to be standardizing and probably gatekeeping more. Like we've gone too far on the other side where we're not gatekeeping our professionals enough, which is ironic because I'm sure any professional listening to this is like, but it's so hard to get licensed and it's such a process. And I'm like, yeah, but I'm arguing that like maybe some of those processes should change and we should like have like less like GRE tests for going into clinical psych and more like testing like proper which in fairness the EPPP in Canada at least like does test diagnosis and jurisprudence. I guess I'm just arguing it seems like we don't have enough of it, and the science isn't like concrete enough that it's even like easy to do. Do you think it's fine for a sport coach of teenagers to learn and use some psychology specifically regarding cognitive performance as a hobby? Sure. Where should we draw the line of coaches using psychological knowledge? Not like we could legally stop it, but morally. Basically, once they feel like they're maybe getting out of their line and they don't actually confidently like know what the research is or what the topic is in like depth. Like if you're a professional who feels like if you had like a research psychologist who that's their area, question them about it. If you feel like you wouldn't be able to like back yourself at all, you should probably at least look at that. In general though, like using some psychological techniques is like everyone does it all the time. I don't really have a big issue with it. Just being like careful and like not claiming yourself as like an authority. Hold on, my dog's crying. I'm just asking my partner to deal with it. Here you go, bathroom. That's the difference between a psychologist and a psychiatrist. A psychologist is somebody who probably has a BA or Bachelor of Science and then a PhD in psychology, or a PsyD now, or while a psychiatrist is a medical doctor, so an MD, who has specialized into mental health and pharmacology, like pharmacology specific to like mental health stuff. Neural pharmacology, you might call it. What type of dog do I have? I don't know if you can see her. She is a Husky Shepherd. Hopefully you saw her. My thing is so delayed that I don't know. Yeah, you guys saw her. Yeah, she's a Husky Shepherd. She's a little cutie. You have any Anna takes you feel comfortable making? Maybe how it could be resolved? In general, I'm going to make a broad statement of I think we have to be really careful, and I didn't want to get into this with Destiny because I think it's such a touchy thing and there's no like easy answer for him at all. I think it's a really shitty situation, but I want to be careful to not be like villainizing BPD people, not because the like so going through the experience of like I don't know if she is BPD at all. Obviously I'm not diagnosing her. She claims she isn't, so that's fine, but he was talking a lot about BPD, right? And so I think it's important to bring up of like BPD people have it pretty rough, right? They have this mental health problem that causes them oftentimes to engage with others and themselves in really destructive ways. And it's hard not to want to demonize them, especially for people who have experienced it, because as somebody who's experienced like not myself, but I mean like if you're the individual who's experiencing the chaos that might come with having a loved one with BPD, it's really painful and it can be really distressing and upsetting and sometimes even like full on like traumatizing, right? And so the reason why BPD gets villainized is really understandable, but I want to be really careful to make space to saying like a lot of people with BPD do recognize their unhealth and they do seek treatment, and a lot of them become some of the most self-aware people because they necessarily have to, and just kind of giving grace of saying like the behaviors that are really harmful aren't okay. They're not excusable. They absolutely need to be addressed, but trying to see them as a complex person, saying like just because somebody's BPD doesn't mean we're going to monstrify them. We're not just going to say like, oh, don't even bother, right? But at the same time, it's probably like worth having certain cautions up if you're like just getting to know the person, right? Because you don't know the level of like management skills that they have for it. So just I don't know. I think it's tricky because you always need to toe the line of like compassion and also like keeping yourself safe and having boundaries, and that's so much more tricky with anyone with mental health, but particularly like BPD, antisocial, a lot of personality disorders. That balance is more tricky because they just like require more sometimes. Um, so that's about all I'd want to say right now. I really don't. Mr. Girl Returns himself is here. Oh, cool. If Mr. Girl is here, welcome. Apparently people want us to talk. I don't know if he is here. I haven't seen his... Oh, there you are. Hello, welcome. My Discord is telling me to talk to you, so I thought I'd say hi. Hi! I'm pretty tired, so if you're okay, I just talked with Destiny for 4 hours, and I'm a pretty noob streamer, so I'm just like mentally getting tired. But apparently, people think we would have good conversations, good chat times. I'm pretty down to talk to anyone. I don't think I'm super spicy, as you can probably tell from my demeanor, but yeah, I'd absolutely be down to chat sometimes. Yeah, I've got a decent delay, so my apologies. In passing, you mentioned the mental health sector is both underburdened and overburdened. Could you elaborate further on what you mean by that? For sure. So public and free access mental health resources are so overburdened. Private counselors are generally underburdened, if that makes sense. There's oftentimes lots of private counselors who are looking for clients, in large part probably because people can't afford it, fundamentally. So, yeah. Good question. Thanks for getting me to clarify that. That was a really good question. Okay, good. I'm trying to follow these chats in here. You guys seem to be having a thread right now, so I'll just let you guys do that. Oh shit, here come that boy. Everyone's really excited that you're here, so thanks for coming. Sorry about the delay. Wow, I was really delayed in getting to you, Mr. Girl. That's cringe. I want to DM you to invite you to talk about Dr. K sometime, but I don't have a Twitter. Okay, I finally got to it. Haha, I was so buried. Yeah, DM me on Instagram. I do have a Twitter, but it's like I don't think I've posted one thing on it. Twitter's like not my I'm Canadian, so we don't really use Twitter that often here. And I've heard it's a pretty intense place on Twitter. I have a hard time with social media in general. But yeah, definitely DM me. We can chat. I've definitely seen some of your stuff, Mr. Girl. I've like watched you talk with Destiny. I watched some of your older stuff as well. You're definitely a very interesting character, so I imagine we'd have interesting talks. I think probably we would disagree about like some mental health stuff, so that could be like an interesting space to explore. If you have a hard time, then stay away from Twitter. It's terrible. Yeah, it's more just like so I guess I should clarify. Social media doesn't like it's not hard on me because I get really sad. I've worked with like really, really spicy clients, so I don't really get like my feelings hurt. It's more like I want to try to keep a decent, healthy balance between like social media online world and like my hobbies, like the dog and like just like other leisure activities that I do and stuff like that. And I find like I just tend to get kind of obsessive about whatever I'm enjoying, and I really enjoy this space. So I need to have space between me and social media sometimes and like put my phone away. And so I'm like hesitant to add Twitter because it's so fast moving that I'm like worried that it's just going to be like another thing that I'm like having to like figure out a balance from. Do I have a set streaming schedule? I don't. I just started on Saturday, actually. So I'm kind of like coming out the gate running. So I'm going to kind of look at it. I still work part-time. Oh, I get really sad. Twitter makes me miserable. Yeah, it destroys your hobbies and relationships with yourself too. Yeah, exactly. And so I just want to be careful about that work-life balance. I'm the kind of personality that if I don't set boundaries for myself, I will work myself into the ground. And I've done it multiple times, and it's really bad for my marriage. It's really bad for my physical and mental health. I don't work out anymore. So, just in general, that's my hesitation for Twitter. Um, is there a way to see the studies you spoke to Destiny about? Yes. So what I'll maybe do is I'm going to post them permanently in my Discord channel, which I know is obnoxious. I'll post them here again because I just have them available. Saturday and already 800. Am I at 800 followers? Well, today I started at like 180, so that's really exciting. Thank you, everyone. So there's one study. I just posted it. That is the study on IQ and there not being a difference. I didn't send this to him, but if you're interested on whether autism testing works on adults with the ADOS, I have this available. Boop. As a fellow Canadian, what are your thoughts in general about Jordan Peterson and his work? I've answered this a fair bit, but I know you haven't been here. Overall, I think his psychological work is excellent. I think he's actually a very good psychologist. I don't have too many issues with his political takes, but I'm not deeply, deeply informed on politics myself, unlike like somebody like Destiny. And so it's possible that if I got more informed, I'd have some different views. But I did write down his legitimate critiques, and I'm going to look at it again. But overall, I've probably focused more on Jordan Peterson's like mythological, philosophical stuff, and I enjoy that a fair bit. I find it very insightful. Is the article related to memory from 2 weeks ago posted somewhere publicly where we can read it? Oh gosh. You're gonna, Spider, you're gonna have to remind me. An article related to memory from 2 weeks ago. Well, I wasn't streaming 2 weeks ago. So I don't know if you're seeing that the article was released 2 weeks ago. Yeah, I'm just not sure. Resay my schedule? Yes. I said I don't have one yet. I'm trying to still basically figure out a balance between this and work. A lot of my work I can actually do on stream. However, certain parts of it I can't. So I'm trying to still make affiliate because I just literally started Saturday. And so I need to just like figure that stuff out first. So once I'm affiliate, I'll probably make a more concentrated schedule. I'm just basically trying to stream like every day this week, so I just get affiliate and can kind of move on to the next level and start doing stuff. After that, it'll probably be I'll probably try to do like 2 to 3 times a week minimum, maybe more. I don't know. I'm really enjoying this. I mean, the reality is like if I start like getting a lot of traction and it seems to be like able to like replace like even my part-time job basically, then like it will just steadily increase. So yeah. If you guys enjoy it, just give me a follow, give me like little shout outs. That'll kind of level and give engagement will probably impart to it. If it seems like this is helpful and people have like more desire for it, then I'll happily do it. If it's like you're useless garbage and nothing you say is helpful, that's super fair too. Are the hours in psychometry really flexible, or is that just a function of your position? So right now I'm not working in a psychometric position. I'm trained in it. I've actually got this super cool opportunity to run an online mental health program, and I like got to build it from scratch, kind of. I've run into a lot of issues with it, but right now I'm program directing this mental health program. So yeah. Would you recommend victims of abuse to pursue legal action? I'm aware that there's a lot of different cases of abuse. Just want a general view. If they would like to. The legal system for an abuse victim is rough because of the nature of the court system itself, right? The fact that you have a defense lawyer for the prosecutor is tough. So if you're at the place where you like it takes a lot of gall, like it really does, because you're gonna have to like be exposed to it. You're gonna have to come across lots of people naysaying your abuse experience. So it's like it's kind of really, I think it's fundamentally up to the individual. Obviously the benefit of taking them to court is that if they're a serial abuser or like assaulter or something like that, you can get them off the streets potentially. But a lot of times the sentencing that they get is frustrating. Thanks, Mr. Gull. I'll talk to you later. I'm sure I'm 10 minutes late, but thanks for stopping by. So do you agree with his view on women in the workplace not being allowed to wear makeup? That's not actually his view from my understanding. I think he's literally just trying to pose the question, and I think Destiny brings up a valid critique of saying the way you pose the question and kind of outline your concerns about it leads to certain implications that aren't good. And I think the problem is that when he said it, he wasn't really trying to get those implications at all. He was just kind of posturing the question of like, we don't really know how men and women should work with one another. I would be shocked if he was legitimately opposed to women wearing makeup in the workplace, and I would disagree with it if he was, I guess. Is an article written or posted 2 weeks ago? Oh man, I'm gonna have to think about that. The main articles I posted were from like 2 years ago, 2020, which is this one. And sorry, I said I was gonna post both of them. There's also, I have it pulled up right now. There's also this one about DID. Yeah, I haven't really been following him much recently on newer stuff, but I am wondering if he's kind of falling into like the burned by like his scorners trap, which I think is like, it's actually like a deeply human thing. So I like, it's hard to like it's valid to say that's probably not the best, but also like it's hard to like critique it beyond that because it's like so human, you know. It's just like the situation with like Destiny and Anna. It's pretty hard to like lay too much critique at Destiny's feet, even if there's situations where I'm like, yeah, he probably could have handled that better. I'm just like, God, it's such a shit situation at this point, and it's like there's almost no recourse for him. That it's like, it's pretty hard to to critique him at this point. Basically means like I expect perfection at all time from somebody, and I just can't. He said that there can only be one reason women wear makeup. Yes, which is like to increase their sexual like attraction and stuff like, and like their aesthetic, which is like to some extent true. It's just the problem is like, where does that go, right? And is that a problem? I don't think that that's necessarily a problem. I have no problem with women like looking more attractive. If you guys give me a tea for 2 seconds, my dog is desperately trying to go to the bathroom, and my partner is playing League, and I don't think realizes that she's desperately begging to go outside. There you go, buddy. Luckily, I have a wireless headset. I remember somebody asked me what is my headset. My headset is an Arctic 7. It's mediocre, as you can probably hear. My voice, not super great. It sounds a little robot-y, but yeah, it's not too bad. Classic League player, I know. That's why I will probably never get into League, because A, I'll probably suck at it, and B, it seems to just like destroy your life. Partner is playing League. Thank God there is hope for me, Pog. What rank is he? I don't know if I think he's still Gold 1. He's been trying for Plat for a long time. Not a good look, right? I know, that's fair. That's a very valid critique. He's a Deerheart though. I'm a big fan. He's also in my Discord if you ever want to chat to him. Usually, like when people ask for dating advice, I recommend you talk to men who have actually achieved long-term relationships with women that you like might want a relationship with in the future, or like embody a bunch of traits that you find desirable. Not that I'm saying you're all attracted to me. I'm saying like if you find me interesting and intriguing and you're like, I kind of want a woman who's like open to gaming and all these things, probably talk to the men who achieve those long-term relationships more than the women, because I've actually never pursued myself, so, or another woman like me, so, or any woman for that matter, actually. Talk to me, GigaChat. Mizkif's girlfriend name would probably enjoy chatting with you. She does save animal stuff. So cool. Ms. Kiff's girlfriend. Yeah, if anyone knows her name, pop it in. I'm just kind of like writing them down. I like how Destiny gave me like two people that I'm like, like I'll definitely talk to them, but it's like I'm definitely like not somebody who like seeks and thrives like drama and like dispute. I think it's important to like correct bad information. But like I've listened to some of Demon Mama's takes on stuff, and I have some really big concerns with it. The problem is that I think I'm probably a little bit still like nicey nice, like probably more nicey nice than I should be on a Twitch sphere. Yeah, it would be kind of like painful when people start like, I have like a really soft spot for like any trans individual. So if she like ever like went into like stuff like that, and like it would be hard not to like want to just like give all there, because I really do have like a heart for trans individuals. I think they've got it like so fucking rough, and I really like a lot of them. So I don't know. She does have the spiciest takes. With Tafdash, Destiny is talking to her later today. Okay, sure. Taftash. Don't talk to Demon Mama unironically, one wrong word and you will be labeled hateful. Yeah, that's kind of the main thing, is I'm like, as I like, Destiny is like literally like, he's been streaming for 10 years, he's got an established base, like he's not really going anywhere. Whereas it's like, if I actually want to be like helpful in this space, I do think that there's like some validity to being like, you need a decent like grounding before you can just like start doing like crazy stuff, right? So I'm not at all opposed to talking to anyone. I will debate people. I just think like there's this reality of like, when you're the new kid on the block, like you need to be smart basically, and like not just like make enemies with everyone. Mind you, like Mr. Girl came in and he was just like, I don't give a fuck, and it worked super well for him. So like maybe I'm just being like a little big baby, but yeah. By the way, Peterson didn't argue for no makeup. He only asked interviewer people why people use makeup in the first place. Yeah, and like I can understand from optics why that doesn't look good. I probably tend to give him a lot of benefit of the doubt, maybe more than I should even. But I think if you really hate him, it's easy to give him way less benefit than he probably deserves. What study, WRT, the study you discussed with Destiny, there's a serious problem with the logic you went through as it pertains to race realism. Genes which determine race can be completely independent from those which determine IQ, but due to the fact that genotypes are passed down as a package from parents, and thus you can't arbitrarily randomly sample segments of genes from the population, means you would still expect to see high correlations between phenotypes. Yes, but basically my argument with that is because the heritability differs, the capacity for it doesn't differ. And so when we're seeing racial IQ disparities, it probably to me actually proves that there's like some systemic racism going on. Like there's something else causing it, because it's not, in my mind, entirely just the genes. But yeah, it's definitely, the study I have isn't actually like like I call it like a kick in the knees, but you're right, they're gonna worm out of it right away. The problem is that it's like, unless basically I can get a list of the genes that influence IQ, which we don't have, and the genes that influence race, which we don't have, and be like, look, there's no overlap, I can't perfectly prove it. That's the problem, and like, we're just not there yet in the science. So that's the frustrating part. But it's definitely another piece of evidence to put against race realism in my position. How much Destiny content have you consumed? Would you consider yourself a DDGer yet? Oh yeah, I really like Destiny. He's been really good to encourage any area where I wasn't consistent in. I find I learn by watching people. I don't just learn their positions. I actually find I like tend to more so learn how they think, and I can kind of put myself in that position, and it really improves my thought processing. So he's really improved my own capacity to like check my own positions and be like, are these consistent with other similar positions? And if they're not, you should probably figure out why, right? So yeah, I definitely have a big heart for Destiny. I really like him. I don't know if I like fangirl over anyone, but that's just like my personality. I just tend to like be pretty steady Eddie. I just kind of take people as they come. Vosh would be interesting. He likes the optics and rhetoric games, so that would be interesting. Yeah, the thing about Vosh that gets me really frustrated when I listen to him is he just does like a lot of like that esoteric jargon spinning that like, it probably seems like I do that too, but I actually like really try to avoid just like using like really big words when more simpler common parlance words would have just equally sufficed, and stringing together these like long, complex like monologues, in part because, to be honest, like when people like monologue at length, which is ironic because I'm literally monologuing right now, I get bored. Like I just can't focus the whole time. And so I think with Vosh, I'd have a really hard time of just being like, I'm just like getting lost in the rhetoric over and over. And I'm not like a super adept debater or anything. So I think that could be a really big struggle. Do talk to Demon Mommy, but only if you're up for her calling you transphobic afterwards, because there's a 90% chance she will if you start to gain ground against her positions. Yeah, that's why I'm saying I'm definitely willing to talk to her. I don't want to be like scared. I also like want to be careful that like I'm at least not actually being like transphobic, because like I said, I actually have like a really big heart for trans individuals, and I think they've got a really rough go, and so I would never want to ever like dismiss just like the experience of those people. But if you're getting called a transphobe, if you have like a decently solidified base and you haven't been on Twitch for like less than a week, that probably would go over well. Like I said, just for those who are like just tuning in again, I've only been here since literally this Saturday, so I might like take a couple more days to have like I knew probably Destiny and I would broadly agree on things, which is why I reached out to him actually before I even started on Twitch, because I just like it's a good space to just talk with somebody who like you're smart, you're intelligent, we'll probably have a really good conversation. You're probably going to challenge me on some things that are going to like grow my view, so it's going to be like productive. I might be able to challenge you on some things, which could be productive, but more importantly, we'll probably mostly agree, so like it won't be like jumping into like fire from like day one, because that's just yeah. I'm worried people will smear you as transphobic or something. People are quick to judge and often will judge incorrectly. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure I'll get smeared with lots of things, but I think that's something like in the social media space you just like have to adjust to. The problem is that like if they smear you because you've like worded something not great, like Jordan Peterson's makeup comment, right? The reason why the smear sticks pretty well is because it's like, yeah, it doesn't look great. It's not super obvious what he's implying, and the implications of it are pretty not great, right? So, yeah. Do you know a game called Disco Elysium? No, I do not. Is it a good game? Okay. The only thing race realists know about psychology is the IQ race stuff. I know. It's really frustrating. And it's, as you guys even saw today, trying to explain IQ with statistics is really frustrating, and it's like pretty obvious to me that I need to like, because like genetics isn't something I'm like deeply versed on. I've like taken a couple of courses in it. I've like definitely done like my biology, but it's not like I've done like 7 years in psychology, right? And so it's like when people are like, well, why aren't these like gene things and stuff, and I'm just like, I'm pretty sure I know why, but it's probably rudimentary, and because it's rudimentary, there's probably major things that I'm missing that if I could give it to you would actually explain in full what's going on. And so the IQ stuff is like an interesting thing, and I'm willing to talk to people about it. It just gets dicey because it's really complex to explain, because it's like all statistics and stuff like that, and statistics are just my bane of existence as far as like explaining. Nothing wrong with women wanting to look sexier by using makeup, but if it becomes the norm, then women who don't want to wear it become like really disadvantaged, right? That's the problem with makeup. To an extent, yeah. Like there's definitely been times, like even on my TikTok, where I posted a video where I just was wearing no makeup, and my eyebrows, I have to tint them to make them look darker. They're actually really light blonde. And so like an immediate comment was like, I think I was talking about pretty privilege, and the person's like, it's really weird that you'd talk about pretty privilege when like you're just average. And I'm like, okay, you think that I'm just, and like nobody says just average, is like you're just like normal, like, and that's totally fine. Like it's definitely always a negative thing, is how it's usually implied. And like, and fair enough, I'm totally fine with being physically average, but the problem is like if you think what is average is women wearing makeup, then you have no conception of what average people look like. Like that's more of the issue. Is there any new research into OCD and why medication seems to not be so effective? Good question. OCD is on my list to redo. I haven't looked into OCD research for a long time. I've looked more into OCD, ADHD, differential diagnosis, but not like treating OCD specifically. Probably a large part is we can't fully agree on whether OCD is like a purely anxiety disorder or if it has like psychotic elements to it. And the way you treat psychotic disorders and anxiety disorders can somewhat overlap, because sometimes like tranks, like things that bring your psychosis down, is good, but sometimes you can't treat anxiety then because you're so numbed out. And the way you treat anxiety is by exposing them to things that distress them in safe, manageable amounts, and then teaching their system that it's not the end of the world and that like they can recover, basically. Vosh has a degree in sociology, so he likes the big words he learned. Oh no. I don't get along very well usually with sociology students, so yeah. Talk to Mr. Girl, he's very open and he uses big words. Yeah, actually he just DM'd me, so I'm definitely going to talk to him sometime. That'll be cool on Instagram. I'm not going to talk to him on Instagram, sorry, he DM'd me on Instagram. I'm just reminding myself. Actual list of interesting people. Dr. K, Mr. Girl. Yeah, I need to watch more Dr. K, because Mr. Girl wants to talk about Dr. K. I tend not to watch too many psychologists for leisure because I do it as a job. So I haven't actually watched Dr. K. Maya Higa. No idea who that is, but sure. I will just reach out to people. Wicked Supreme might be good to talk to. Wait. Wicked. Yeah, I really like the one-on-ones. I think they're more conducive. You can find common ground a lot better, and then you can actually do like better education and like idea growing, right? Like after talking one-on-one with Destiny, I've been able to be like, okay, here are some other areas in like the IQ discourse that I should probably improve on if I'm gonna do a better job of like dismantling stuff. If you want to talk like IRL political activism, Hanzo of Hakir would be good. Maybe. I'm not sure how much into politics I want to get into, in large part because usually politics is American politics, and I'm Canadian. Not that it doesn't overlap at all, but I find it's just like getting specialized knowledge on American policy feels not like the most productive thing I could do as a Canadian, who is like, if I'm gonna like learn about politics in depth for this stuff at all, I should probably learn my own country first. That would probably be like more helpful, because if I care about it enough, I should probably be doing something about it, right? Like volunteering with candidates I believe in, stuff like that. So yeah, it would be interesting hearing you talking on Dr. K on the disconnect between the clinician side and the psychiatry therapy academic side. Yeah, like I said, like my positions on it, I've thought about a lot, so I'm pretty firm on what they are, but I also recognize that it might alienate me from people within my field, because not everyone likes my positions, right? Because it makes counseling psychologists feel like I'm saying that they're like trash goblins who don't know anything, and it's like, I'm obviously not saying that, but I can definitely understand why you might feel like I'm saying that. IQ is literally just a comparative rank order metric. Explaining comparative rank ordered metrics is super hard. Yes. And if anyone, like, I know Khan Academy, I just don't find that they actually convert things into like simple like lay analogies very well. Like for my forensic work, I actually am going to have to take like a special course by my supervisor teaching me exclusively about how to talk to judges about these stats, which I'm just not in that yet. So hopefully it will get better over time. That's the beauty, is I'm a growing, changing human. So hopefully by this time next year, I will be even smarter and more informed than I am now. Thank you. My therapist has never been explaining it like that in this understandable way. You're so welcome. Ironically, the opposite of your therapy take. I don't know what that's in recognition to. Just to get your opinion, what would be your opinion on doing lectures-oriented streams? I do public speaking and teaching all the time. It's actually why in debates I can kind of like monologue forever. It's something in debate I really need to work on, is like concision, because I'm so used to teaching and educating, where like I'm used to people not asking the questions that they basically feel too stupid to ask. So I try to predict what questions people might have from what I've presented and then answer them preemptively. And then I do that in debates, and I need to realize in debates, just say the thing and let them ask. Whereas in teaching, you want to say the thing and predict what they need to ask, but they're not going to. Trash Goblins Unite. Yeah, maybe that'll be like our community name is just Trash Goblins. I don't think there's anything wrong with not being like as empirically sound as gifted with people. I just think that they're different strengths, and I just wish that there was more space between like practitioner and researchers to just like actually appreciate each other more. Because I value both sides actually a lot. I think like the best practitioners are the most empirically informed, but it's really hard to stay up on your empiricism if you're like working at a hospital where you're so busy all the time. Like you're not like going home from like a 10 to 12-hour shift and being like, okay, like what's the data, you know? So it's easy to just fall behind the research, which I think is what happens to a lot of practitioners. Is they're not like bad people, they're not trying to be like terrible people, they just like fall behind. And now there's also a lot of these like kind of um, how do I say, um, somewhat predatory schools that are like willing to train people for like a lot of money, but don't actually offer that great of education, which is super sucky for people who are like, I just want to help people, and you're telling me my degree sucks, and I'm like, sort of, but that doesn't mean that you suck. We just need to like figure out how to like be like, maybe there's a space for counselors, and maybe we shouldn't say that counselors are psychology experts. We should say that they're like human counseling experts. And that's valuable. Really valuable. Because if you've ever had a really good counselor and a really shit counselor, holy shit. Good counselors are amazing. And there's lots of really. I personally, the counselor I go to is wrong about most of her empirical data. And she'll like give me something and I'll be like, actually, that's not true, just so you know. And she'll always be like, oh, like roll her eyes at me a little bit. But damn, is she a good therapist. Like, really good. Like, she'll like call me on my shit and like notice like patterns in my like self narrative that I'm like, oh, that is there. And you're at like, usually my go-to is being like, my therapist, if my therapist says something about me, she's 100% right. If she says it about psychology, she's right like 50 to 25% of the time. What are your thoughts on PMHNPs, psych NPs, nurse practitioners, and their ability to effectively treat patients? Are they trained enough compared to other mental health professionals? Nurses are pretty badass, because I find a lot of people who go into nursing and stuff are just naturally gifted with people anyways. And most people who say counselor, is that interchangeable with therapist? Depending on the state, yes, or province, depending on where you are. So usually people are actually counseling therapists, but psychologists can be counseling psychologists, and I kind of lump them in with counselors, which they won't like, because a counseling therapist usually has the least amount of like rigorous training, whereas a lot of counseling psychologists actually have a lot of rigorous training. They just they tend to just focus a lot more on like the work with other people. But then there's now like counseling psych programs I personally know of that are almost exclusively focused on research, and I'm just like, this is just getting so confusing. Like, we should just agree. We should just agree on what things are and then go from there. But part of the issue is that a clinical psych program, which is like that highly empirical program, is actually more competitive right now than medical school. So there are a lot of counseling psych programs popping up that are doing basically the clinical psych education, but they're allowing people without that like super high GPA in. So yeah, it's a complex issue for sure. Do counselors need to go to university? Yes, most counselors need a minimum of a master's, and in a lot of places they also need a PhD, but not all counseling. Most counseling therapists need just a master's. To be a psychologist, you need a master's or a PhD, depending on where you are. And to be a clinical psychologist, you almost always just have a PhD. Sometimes you don't even have the master's. They do like a master's PhD synthesis program where you come out with just a PhD. Good questions. Really good questions. Thank you for the answer. I'm in California thinking about going to an MFT to be a therapist, but also considering other options. Yeah, absolutely. Like, just figure out what you want to do and what you're good at. And like, really, I want to emphasize, like, I know lots of like counseling therapists who are like my counselor is a counseling therapist. She's technically got the least empirical training ever, but damn, she's good. And I've gone to like a full-on clinical psychologist, and it just wasn't what I need. In part because I tend to like only want the science, but what I need from my therapist is like the heart stuff, because I'm always like, but I'm a robot, you know. So yeah. All right. right. I think we'll probably try to end there. So just so you guys have kind of a heads up on what I'm doing in the next few days, since I don't have a schedule up yet. Um, what day is it today? It's Wednesday. So tomorrow I am busy all day with like personal life stuff and work. So I might stream a little bit during the day if I do some work, because then you guys can watch just like what work looks like and you can pop in and ask some questions. It actually helps keep me on focus because you guys are like watching what I'm doing, and so if I like just am on my phone, somebody's gonna be like, "Hey, why aren't you working?" And I'll be like, eh. So I'll probably stream a little bit maybe tomorrow for an hour or two. I'm going to be working on a workbook for social anxiety. So I'm going to be giving some really general CBT and basic therapy skills to people in a workbook that's free, that they could just like look through and kind of self-teach some like really basic psychoeducation. It's definitely not a replacement for therapy. And then Friday is my birthday. Yay! Maybe I'll get affiliate on my birthday. Oh no, it won't even be 7 days. So I might not, but we'll see. Maybe I'll get affiliate on my birthday. That would be exciting. So I probably won't be streaming that day just because I have a bunch of stuff planned for my birthday, but yeah. Thanks. I have a question I'm unsure how to express. I've heard of it a long time ago. Broadly speaking, what are your thoughts on mirror neurons? Might be associated with attachment theory. Is it a silly concept? No, mirror neurons are absolutely legitimate. The problem is that there's a lot of people who over assume what they might do. There's a lot of theoretical conjecture that gets taken as fact. So, yeah. Your birthday's Friday too? Oh my gosh, we're twins. You don't have to tell me how old you're turning. I'm turning 28. I don't know if you're turning 28, but that would be exciting. So it's definitely not a silly concept. So if I go like this, your mirror neurons are going to fire a little bit to kind of be like, you might want to like raise your hand, right? If you see me go, oh, and now if your like jaw is itching at you to yawn, that trigger to yawn is a mirror neuron firing. We do believe it's probably the basis and part of empathy. However, empathy, it's like the best neurological like thing we can put our finger on for like probably empathy. It seems to be the case, right? If I like took my hand and then I took a mallet and I whacked it really hard with a mallet and it looked really excruciatingly painful. Like have you ever watched a video of like an athlete like snapping their arm and then you hold your arm? That's kind of like a mirror neuron empathy of like being like, painful, right? You might even like feel a bit of like aching in your arm, not because you hurt your arm, but because you're kind of empathizing with it. The problem is that a lot of people take mirror neurons and then they're like, so that's why if you like learn about other people's abuse, it's like you're being abused right now. And I'm like, no, that's not true, right? Like that's not true. You're probably experiencing some level of distress for them. That's normal, but it's not the same, right? So yeah. What about inhibitory neurons? So there's lots of inhibitory. It's pretty broad. There's lots of mirror neurons are much more specific. Inhibitory neurons are like all over your brain. There's inhibitory neurotransmitters, all sorts of stuff. Oh, come on, don't yawn at us. I know. I'm going to get all your mirror neurons firing. Really hope to have more smart, grounded female presence on Twitch. Really think you could have a great role. Thank you, 30 to 1. Enjoy work. And I'm also really excited to be here. I hope that things are fun. I'm an empath, yeah. If anyone's ever seen like the TikToks that are like making fun of empaths and being like, my friend, like literally like rolling on the ground, bleeding out from their arm, they're like, ah, like screaming in anguish. Me, an empath. I think something might be wrong with them, right? It's funny. 3 ideas loosely associated in my mind that with that mirror neuron. Attachment theory, therapy outcome with secure connection with the therapist, over time early abuse outcome when there's at least one strong connection while growing up, and the idea you brought up with destiny of Latin African outcome of schizophrenia. More folks in the environment interact might give a person a greater chance to develop a good connection. Yeah, it's possible that basically mirror neurons are what we would call the neurological correlate for where that healing that you're talking about happens, right? And this is kind of the gap between our neuroscience certainly hasn't caught up with where our theoretical psychological science is. We know that for some reason, when you have a person who has really bad attachment from early childhood experiences, and then you replace it well, you give them a therapist that they get a really secure attachment to, and then you give them other like community settings like the Latin African outcome of schizophrenia, and you kind of fill up their attachment needs in those things. You can kind of undo the damage and the wiring that the bad attachment did early on, and teach them how to have like a healthy attachment later. So yeah, I think that that's a very possible thing. It's quite likely that mirror neurons are definitely neurologically related to how these things are helpful. But that's the problem, is there's kind of this gap between where we like psychologically like seem to know things help people versus like what we know neurologically is going on for them, if that makes sense. Yeah, no worries. Okay, it's 4:18, so I went 20 minutes longer than I said I would. I am going to pop off for today. I'm gonna go take my dog on a nice walk. I'm going to shave my armpits because I keep noticing them that they're hairy, and not that you guys needed to know that. And just do life. But I really appreciate you guys stopping by and chatting with me, and for all my new followers, welcome, and hopefully we can have good conversations in the future. Bye.